First principles thinking. This is one of the most powerful mental models for understanding reality. It allows you to cut through assumptions, get to the core of a problem, and build solutions from the ground up. Most people rely on borrowed thinking. They do what others have done, make small tweaks, or follow standard rules. That might work for simple tasks. But when the challenge is new, complex, or broken, copying the past usually fails. First principles. Thinking starts by asking, what do I know for sure? What are the basic facts, independent of trends, habits, or opinions? Once you've got those, you rebuild from scratch. Here's a simple example. Imagine you're trying to eat healthier. Most people look up popular diet plans or follow what worked for someone else. But first principles thinking asks, what does my body actually need to function well? At the most basic level, it needs enough protein, vitamins, energy, and hydration. Once you understand those needs, you can build a diet that works for you, regardless of fads, labels, or influences. This way of thinking changes how you approach everything: health, work, money, even relationships. It makes you ask better questions. It forces you to stop leaning on defaults and start thinking clearly. It's not about being a contrarian. It's about getting to what's real. Because when you understand the fundamentals, you don't just copy what works. You understand why it works. That gives you power, not just to follow, but to innovate. First principles. Thinking won't make decisions for you, but it gives you something better, clarity. And in a noisy world, that might be the most valuable tool of all. Second-order thinking. Some decisions feel right in the moment, but end up causing problems later. That is where second-order thinking comes in. Second-order thinking is a mental model that helps you look beyond the immediate outcome of a decision and consider what might happen next. Instead of stopping at the first effect, you ask what that effect might lead to. This kind of thinking helps you anticipate long-term consequences and avoid unintended results. For example, imagine a company cuts prices to attract more customers. First-order thinking says lower prices equal more sales. But second-order thinking asks what happens after that. Maybe the profit margin shrinks. Maybe competitors drop their prices too, leading to a price war. Maybe the brand becomes associated with cheapness, which hurts its long-term image. What seemed smart at first could turn out to be damaging. This model applies to everyday life too. Suppose you stay up late to finish a project. First-order thinking says you met the deadline. But second-order thinking considers the impact of lost sleep. Will your focus drop tomorrow? Will that lead to more mistakes or missed opportunities? The goal is not to overthink every decision. It is to slow down enough to consider more than just the immediate win. Many of the worst outcomes in history, from failed policies to financial crises, happened because people only looked one step ahead. Second-order thinking does not require advanced knowledge. It just takes the habit of asking, and then what? Over and over until you see the bigger picture. It helps you make choices that are not just good today, but still make sense tomorrow. In a world full of quick fixes and short-term rewards, this kind of thinking gives you an edge that most people overlook. Circle of competence. Everyone has things they're good at and things they're not. The problem is, most of us think we know more than we do. The circle of competence is a mental model that helps fix that. It simply means knowing what you understand well and staying within that area when making important decisions. You don't have to know everything. You just need to know what you actually know and be honest about what you don't. Your circle might include topics you've studied, problems you've solved, or industries you've worked in. For example, A doctor probably has a strong grasp of medical decisions, but might not be the best person to guess where interest rates are headed. A software engineer might be great at designing systems, but not necessarily qualified to give parenting advice. The point is, being smart in one area doesn't mean you're smart in all of them. Trouble starts when people step outside their circle without realizing it. An investor might take a risky bet on a business they don't understand. A leader might ignore expert advice and try to fix something they've never dealt with before. When decisions go wrong in these situations, it's often not about intelligence. It's about drifting too far outside the boundary of what they actually know. This model is not about limiting growth. It's about making better choices. Knowing your circle helps you act with more confidence when you're inside it, and ask better questions when you're not. It keeps you grounded and reduces overconfidence, which is a major source of error in both everyday life and big decisions. Understanding the limits of your knowledge is a strength, and recognizing where those limits are, that's the value of knowing your circle of competence. Thought experiment. You don't always need a lab to test an idea. Sometimes all you need is your mind. A thought experiment is a mental exercise where you imagine a situation to explore its logic, consequences, or contradictions. It is a way of testing ideas without needing to physically run an experiment. Philosophers, scientists, and thinkers have used thought experiments for centuries to challenge assumptions and uncover deeper truths. One of the most famous examples is Schrödinger's cat. In this setup, a cat is placed in a sealed box with a mechanism that has a 50% chance of killing it based on a random quantum event. Until someone opens the box, the cat is considered both alive and dead at the same time. Schrödinger was not suggesting anyone should do this. He was using the scenario to highlight the strange behavior of particles in quantum physics. Thought experiments work because they strip away the noise. By isolating variables in an imagined scenario, they help us focus on the core logic of a problem. For example, the trolley problem, often used in ethics discussions, forces people to confront difficult trade-offs by removing distractions and zeroing in on one moral choice. These mental models are not just for scientists and philosophers. Anyone can use them. You might imagine how a new policy would affect a company before trying it. Or picture how someone might react to a decision you are about to make. In both cases, you're mentally simulating outcomes to improve your thinking. Thought experiments do not give you answers, but they make your thinking sharper. They help clarify complex issues, reveal hidden assumptions, and push ideas to their limits, all without leaving your chair. Probabilistic thinking. Most people want a clear answer, yes or no, right or wrong, win or lose. But the real world rarely works like that. Probabilistic thinking is a mental model that helps you deal with uncertainty. Instead of asking, will this happen or not? It asks, how likely is this to happen? It is about thinking in terms of chances and weighing possibilities instead of relying on black and white outcomes. Imagine you are planning a picnic. The weather forecast says there is a 30% chance of rain. That does not mean it will rain or it won't. It means there is a 3 in 10 chance you will get wet. A lot of people ignore that and plan as if it is definitely going to be sunny or definitely going to storm. Probabilistic thinking means you prepare for both and manage the risk. This mindset becomes even more important when the stakes are high. A business might launch a new product knowing there is a 60% chance of success, but also a 40% chance of failure. That does not mean they made a bad decision if it fails. It just means they took a calculated risk. Over time, consistently making decisions based on good probabilities is what leads to success. Probabilistic thinking also helps avoid emotional overreactions. If something unlikely happens, like a rare event or a freak accident, it does not always mean you made a bad call. It just means you were playing the odds, and sometimes the odds don't break your way. This kind of thinking requires practice. It means getting comfortable with uncertainty, using data when possible, and making peace with the fact that good decisions can still lead to bad outcomes. It is not about predicting the future perfectly. It is about playing the game wisely over time. Inversion. People try to reach their goals by asking what they need to do. But there's another approach that's often more effective. Ask what to avoid. Inversion is a mental model that flips a problem on its head. Instead of only thinking forward, you also think in reverse. If the goal is success, inversion asks what would cause failure. If the goal is happiness, inversion asks what creates misery. It works by focusing on what not to do, which is often more obvious and easier to control. This kind of thinking is useful because we're often too focused on ideal outcomes. We imagine what we want, but ignore the obstacles that stop people from getting there. Inversion brings those blind spots to the surface. It is a practical way to avoid common mistakes before they happen. For example, if you want to run a successful meeting, most people plan the agenda and talking points. Inversion asks what would ruin the meeting, maybe showing up unprepared, dominating the conversation, or not listening. Avoiding those things could be just as important as what you include. It applies across all kinds of decisions. Athletes use it to identify habits that lead to injury. Startups use it to predict what might cause them to fail. Even in relationships, you can use inversion to avoid behaviors that damage trust. Inversion does not mean you only focus on the negatives. It means you balance your thinking by working from both directions. Forward thinking shows you what to aim for. Inversion shows you what to steer away from. The two together create a clearer path. By removing the obvious sources of failure, inversion often reveals what really matters, long before the consequences arrive. It is a simple shift in mindset, but one that changes how problems are solved. Occam's razor. When something goes wrong, people often jump to the most complicated explanation. But more often than not, the simplest answer is the right one. Occam's razor is a mental model that helps you cut through confusion. It suggests that when you're faced with multiple explanations for the same thing, the one with the fewest assumptions is usually the most accurate. It's not about being lazy or ignoring complexity. It's about not adding extra layers unless you really need to. Let's say your internet stops working. One explanation is that the entire service provider's infrastructure has failed. Another is that your Wi-Fi router just needs to be restarted. Occam's razor would tell you to start with the second one. It's simpler, it relies on fewer assumptions, and in most cases, it turns out to be correct. This kind of thinking is useful because people love complex stories. We often overcomplicate problems, not because the situation demands it, but because our brains like patterns, drama, or hidden meanings. Occam's razor helps counter that tendency by reminding us to keep our reasoning grounded. In science, the model plays a huge role. If two theories predict the same result, scientists prefer the one that is simpler and cleaner, as long as it still fits the evidence. The same idea applies in business, medicine, and everyday problem solving. Occam's razor is not a guarantee that the simplest idea is always true. It's just a rule of thumb that keeps you from adding unnecessary explanations too soon. It helps you focus on what is most likely, instead of getting lost in what is merely possible. In a world full of noise, this kind of clarity makes decisions faster, reasoning sharper, and thinking more reliable. Hanlon's razor. You send someone a message, and they don't reply. Hours go by, then days. It's easy to assume they're ignoring you on purpose. But what if they just forgot? Hanlon's razor is a mental model that helps you interpret other people's actions with more clarity and less stress. It says, never attribute to malice that which can be explained by mistake, forgetfulness, or basic human error. In other words, most people aren't trying to harm you. They're just distracted, rushed, or unaware. This idea is important because we're naturally wired to take things personally. If someone cuts us off in traffic, shows up late, or forgets to follow through, it's tempting to assume bad intentions. But Hanlon's razor encourages us to pause and consider a more likely explanation. They weren't thinking about us at all. It doesn't mean people never act with bad intent. Some do. But most of the time, poor outcomes come from miscommunication, not manipulation. People miss meetings because they wrote the wrong time. They don't respond to emails because they got buried in their inbox. They seem rude because they're having a rough day, not because they're targeting anyone. Using Hanlon's razor reduces unnecessary conflict. It helps in relationships, in the workplace, and in public life. It encourages a mindset that gives others the benefit of the doubt, at least until the facts show otherwise. It's not about being naive. It's about not jumping to conclusions too quickly. By applying this mental model, you save energy, avoid pointless arguments, and create more room for understanding. In a world full of stress and assumptions, Hanlon's razor is a tool for staying grounded, patient, and focused on what is actually true. The map is not the territory. When you look at a subway map, it helps you get around the city. But you probably know the map is not drawn to scale. It doesn't show how loud the train is, how crowded the platform gets, or what it smells like underground. It simplifies things so you can make decisions quickly. That's the point. And that's what the map is not the territory is all about. This mental model reminds us that any idea, label, chart, or belief we use to understand something is just a version of the real thing. It can be helpful, but it is never complete. The territory is reality. The map is just a tool we use to try to navigate it. Think of a restaurant review. It might say the service was slow or the food was amazing, but until you go there yourself, you do not know the full story. Maybe the atmosphere is warm. Maybe the staff was overwhelmed that day. Reviews are maps. The actual visit is the territory. This idea also applies to how we think about people. A job title, a personality label, or even a social media profile might seem informative. But none of those tell you who someone really is. They are just snapshots, useful, but not enough. Problems happen when people forget the difference. A manager might rely too much on a spreadsheet and miss what is really going on with the team. A traveller might trust a weather app and leave the umbrella at home, only to get caught in the rain. Mistaking the map for the territory leads to blind spots. That's why this model matters. It teaches us to be cautious with assumptions and to stay alert to what reality is actually telling us. Relativity. You and someone else watch the same movie. You think it was slow and boring. They think it was deep and emotional. Same story, same screen, two completely different reactions. That's relativity in action. Relativity, in this context, is not about physics. It's about perception. It means that the way we interpret the world is shaped by our own position, experiences, and mental frameworks. What seems obvious or logical to one person might seem confusing or wrong to someone else, simply because they're coming from a different angle. Take a thermostat in a room. The temperature is fixed, but one person might feel chilly while another feels warm. Or think about two drivers in traffic. One is rushing to work and sees every red light as an obstacle. The other is coming back from vacation and barely notices the delay. The same situation, but their experience of it is completely different. Relativity also explains why people often talk past each other in debates. A policy that feels necessary and fair to someone in a big city might seem intrusive or impractical to someone in a rural town. Their views aren't random. They're shaped by the environments they know. The frame of reference changes how they interpret the facts. Understanding relativity helps not just with empathy, but with better thinking. It reminds us that our view is just one perspective. It doesn't mean all perspectives are automatically correct, but it does mean we should be cautious about assuming ours is the full picture. Relativity encourages us to look harder at how we form our opinions. It pushes us to question what we take for granted, to notice our blind spots, and to make space for the fact that other people are also seeing the world through lenses of their own. Reciprocity. If you hold the door open for someone, they often say thank you. If you offer to help a friend move, they're more likely to help you later. These small moments are driven by one powerful idea: reciprocity. Reciprocity is the principle that people tend to return what they receive. If someone treats us with kindness, we feel inclined to do the same. If someone is rude or dismissive, we often respond in kind. This simple loop of give and take plays a massive role in how relationships, communities, and even economies function. At its core, reciprocity is about balance. It encourages cooperation, builds trust, and makes social life smoother. Businesses use it in marketing, offering free samples or trials, knowing that people will often feel a pull to give something back. Leaders use it to earn loyalty by showing respect and fairness first. But reciprocity goes deeper than manners or tactics. It reflects a broader truth about human interaction. People tend to mirror what they're shown. If you treat others with honesty, patience, or generosity, that energy often comes back around. Not always and not instantly, but often enough to matter. This makes reciprocity more than just a reaction. It becomes a strategy. When you take the first step in offering something positive with no guarantee of return, you're not just being nice. You're setting the tone for how others relate to you. It's not about keeping score. It's about shaping the environment you're part of. Reciprocity is not magic, but it is reliable. And understanding how it works helps you build better relationships, stronger teams, and a more stable foundation in just about every part of life. In a world full of uncertainty, it is one of the few forces you can influence directly by choosing to go first. Thermodynamics. Thermodynamics might sound like something best left to physicists and engineers, but its principles are quietly shaping your daily life. From your morning coffee cooling down to your phone battery draining, thermodynamics explains how energy behaves, why systems change, and what makes some things irreversible. At its core, thermodynamics is the study of energy, how it moves, transforms, and dissipates. It starts with the first law. Energy can't be created or destroyed. It just changes form. You eat food, your body turns it into motion and heat. A car engine burns fuel to move wheels. The total energy stays constant, only its form changes. But there's a catch. The second law introduces entropy, the natural tendency of systems to move toward disorder. You don't need to do anything for your room to get messy. That's entropy. It's not that order is impossible, it just requires work. Every time energy moves or transforms, some of it becomes less usable, often as heat that can't be fully recaptured. That's why perpetual motion machines don't exist. Why your laptop heats up when it's working hard. why the universe, left to itself, is always leaning toward chaos. These principles explain why ice melts, why engines need cooling systems, and why living things require constant energy input to stay alive. Thermodynamics also governs systems beyond machines and molecules. Economies, ecosystems, even cities, they all require energy to maintain order and resist breakdown. That effort is part of the same universal law. Understanding thermodynamics helps us see the invisible forces behind everyday change. It's not just about equations. It's about how everything, from a melting ice cube to a collapsing star, is part of a bigger energy-driven story. Inertia. It's easier to stay on the couch than to get up and start something. But once you do, it's easier to keep going. That's inertia in action. Inertia is the tendency of things to stay just as they are. If something is still, it wants to stay still. If something is moving, it wants to keep moving in the same direction. This isn't just a rule from physics class. It's a principle that shows up in daily life. At the physical level, inertia comes from mass. A small object, like a tennis ball, can be picked up and moved with little effort. A car, on the other hand, takes serious force to get going, and just as much to bring to a stop. The heavier something is, the more it resists change. But the idea of inertia also applies to habits, systems, and organizations. A routine you've followed for years doesn't change overnight. A business that's been doing things the same way for a decade won't shift course easily. The longer something has been at rest or in motion, the more energy it takes to alter its direction. That's why getting started often feels like the hardest part. Beginning a new project, changing a lifestyle habit, or adjusting a belief all require a push to overcome the initial resistance. But once momentum builds, progress gets easier. Each small step reinforces the next. Inertia is not just a hurdle. It's a force that can work both against you and for you. Once you've put in the energy to change direction, inertia starts to help, keeping that motion going. Whether it's a workout routine, a company strategy, or a creative project, overcoming the early resistance is what opens the door to everything that follows. Friction and viscosity. Every time you push a chair across the floor and it drags instead of gliding, you're dealing with friction. When you try to pour syrup and it oozes instead of flows, that's viscosity. These are the forces that slow things down, not just in physics, but in everyday life. Friction is the resistance between two solid surfaces. It's what makes it hard to slide a box across a rough surface, but it's also what keeps your shoes from slipping when you walk. Without friction, nothing would stay in place. But too much of it, and movement becomes inefficient, even damaging. Viscosity is a similar kind of resistance, but it happens inside fluids. Water flows quickly because it has low viscosity. Honey, with its thick, slow-moving consistency, has high viscosity. In industrial systems, fluids with high viscosity require more energy to pump. But in the right context, like lubricants or paints, it's exactly what's needed. Both friction and viscosity are trade-offs. They slow things down, but they also give control. They're not always problems to solve. They're forces to manage. This idea applies far beyond physics. In software design, user friction is anything that makes a task harder than it needs to be. Long forms, extra clicks, slow loading, all of it reduces flow. In business, friction might mean unnecessary meetings or outdated processes. In social settings, it's the tension that slows cooperation, but also helps establish boundaries. Reducing friction or lowering viscosity makes systems run faster and smoother. But adding just the right amount can create grip, control, and safety. The key is balance. Whether you're moving an object, designing a process, or managing a team, understanding how resistance works gives you more options. You can either push harder or make it easier for things to move. Velocity. In physics, velocity is speed with direction. It tells you not just how fast something is moving, but where it's headed. It's one of the most fundamental ideas in motion, used to describe how planets orbit, how planes fly, and how athletes move across a field. Velocity is not just about raw power or acceleration, it's about purpose. A rocket might launch with incredible speed, but what matters most is the angle it takes. Even a small change in direction can determine whether it reaches orbit or burns up in the atmosphere. This same principle shows up outside of science. A company that's growing fast but doesn't know what problem it's solving might eventually collapse. A person who's busy all day but without a clear goal might still feel stuck. In both cases, there's movement, but not velocity. That's why velocity matters in strategy, in productivity, and in personal growth. It helps you focus, not just on how much effort you're putting in, but whether it's actually moving you closer to your destination. Improving velocity means two things: increasing your pace and refining your direction. That could mean cutting distractions, simplifying tasks, or adjusting course when new information comes in. It's not just about doing more. It's about doing what matters, faster and more directly. In a world full of motion, velocity is what separates progress from noise. It's how we measure real movement toward meaningful goals, whether it's in physics, in business, or in everyday life. Leverage. A small push can move something big, if you apply it in the right place. That's the essence of leverage. Leverage is the idea of using limited effort to produce a much greater result. In physics, it's clear. A lever, a pulley, or a gear turns a small input into a big outcome. You apply force at the right point, and the system multiplies it. But leverage isn't just about mechanics. It's a way of thinking that applies to work, learning, technology, and decision-making. A single coder can write a program used by millions. One well-timed investment can generate massive returns. An effective leader can direct the energy of an entire organization with a few strategic moves. These are all examples of leverage at work, where effort gets amplified through systems, tools, or people. There are many forms of leverage. Financial leverage uses borrowed money to increase potential returns. Labor leverage relies on people, delegating tasks or leading teams. And then there's technology leverage, which uses software, automation, or machines to extend your impact far beyond what you could do alone. Used well, leverage saves time, increases efficiency, and turns good decisions into extraordinary outcomes. But there's a downside. Just as leverage multiplies gains, it also multiplies mistakes. A bad investment, an overextended loan, or an over-automated system can cause damage far greater than the original risk. That's why leverage requires judgment. It works best when you understand the system you're influencing and when you account for second-order effects, those ripple consequences that might not be obvious at first. Leverage is not about doing more. It's about doing what matters most and letting tools, teams, or systems amplify the result. When used carefully, it becomes one of the most powerful forces for progress in any field. Activation energy. Starting is often the hardest part, whether it's going to the gym, cleaning your room, or writing the first sentence of an essay. The biggest challenge is just getting moving. In science, this struggle is called activation energy. It's the minimum amount of energy required to start a chemical reaction. Molecules might have all the right ingredients to react, But until enough energy is added to break the initial barrier, nothing happens. Once that energy threshold is crossed, the reaction often continues on its own. This idea translates directly into daily life. Activation energy is the effort it takes to shift from rest to motion. You might stare at your running shoes for half an hour before finally getting up for a jog. That moment of hesitation is the barrier. But once you take the first few steps, it usually gets easier. The same thing applies in work and creativity. Opening a blank document can feel overwhelming, but type a few words and the task begins to flow. The resistance fades. In each case, the hardest part isn't the work itself. It's overcoming the initial friction that stands in the way of beginning. Understanding activation energy helps explain why procrastination happens. It's not always about laziness or lack of discipline. It's about that invisible cost required to start. And once we see it for what it is, a temporary hurdle rather than a permanent block, it becomes easier to work with. Small tricks, like reducing the size of the task or setting up your environment in advance, can lower that barrier. A single action, like opening the app or putting on your shoes, can be enough to push through. Activation energy shows that meaningful change doesn't require massive effort. It just needs the right spark at the start. Once you're in motion, the rest often follows. Catalysts. Some changes take forever until something speeds them up. In science, that something is called a catalyst. A catalyst is a substance that makes a chemical reaction happen faster without being consumed in the process. It lowers the energy needed to start the reaction and helps it move along more efficiently. In short, it speeds things up without getting used up. Catalysts are everywhere in the natural world. Your body uses enzymes, biological catalysts, to digest food, produce energy, and build new cells. Without them, even simple processes would be far too slow to keep you alive. In industry, catalysts make it possible to refine fuel, manufacture plastics, and clean up pollution. They're often invisible, but nothing would work without them. The idea of a catalyst goes far beyond chemistry. In business, a new tool or strategy can act as a catalyst for growth. A simple change in workflow or a shift in mindset can suddenly make a team more productive. In relationships, a single honest conversation might break months of tension and lead to real progress. Even in personal development, catalysts matter. A book, a podcast, or a chance encounter with the right person at the right time can push you past a barrier you've struggled with for years. The catalyst doesn't do the work for you. It just makes the work more doable. Being a catalyst means creating the right conditions for change to happen faster and easier. It's about introducing the right spark at the right moment. And just like in chemistry, the best catalysts don't force anything. They simply make what's already possible happen more efficiently. Catalysts remind us that change doesn't always require brute force. Sometimes, all it takes is the right influence applied in just the right place. Alloying. Pure gold is beautiful, but it's also soft and easily damaged. Add a small amount of another metal, like copper, and suddenly it's stronger, more durable, and ready to be used in rings, coins, and electronics. That's the power of alloying. Alloying is the process of combining two or more elements, usually metals, to create a material with improved properties. The result isn't just a blend, it's often something entirely better. Bronze, for example, is an alloy of copper and tin. Steel is mostly iron, but with carbon and sometimes other elements added for strength, flexibility, or resistance to rust. The principle behind alloying is simple. Pure materials have limitations, but when combined thoughtfully, their weaknesses can be reduced and their strengths enhanced. One metal might be strong but heavy. Another might be light but brittle. Put them together in the right ratio and you can get the best of both. This idea doesn't stop at materials. In teams, alloying means combining different kinds of expertise. A creative thinker paired with a skilled organizer can achieve more together than either could alone. In individuals, alloying shows up when someone pairs a technical skill with communication or blends discipline with curiosity. These combinations often make people more capable, more flexible, and more valuable. The key to alloying, whether in metal or in life, is balance. Too much of one ingredient can ruin the result. Too little, and the mix stays ineffective. But when the proportions are right, the outcome is something new, stronger, smarter, and better suited for the task at hand. Alloying shows that strength isn't always about purity. Sometimes it's about smart combinations. The right mix can create something entirely different and far more powerful than any part on its own. Natural selection and extinction. No species is guaranteed survival, not even the ones that dominate today. At the core of evolution is a process called natural selection. It's the mechanism by which nature favors traits that help organisms survive and reproduce. When a variation gives an edge, like better eyesight, stronger limbs, or a sharper beak, it becomes more common in future generations. Over time, these small advantages accumulate and shape entire species. But natural selection is only half the story. The other half is extinction. Extinction is the elimination of species that fail to adapt. If an animal can't keep up with environmental changes, food scarcity, or new predators, it disappears. That's not a flaw in the system. It's the system at work. Nature doesn't give out participation trophies, only results. The pressure to adapt is constant, and the cost of falling behind is permanent removal from the evolutionary record. This combination, selection and extinction, is what drives evolution forward. It's why life changes, why diversity exists, and why we're not still living in a world ruled by trilobites and giant ferns. These forces aren't limited to biology. In business, companies that fail to respond to changing markets often disappear. In technology, outdated tools are replaced by faster, smarter alternatives. Even in careers, skills that once guaranteed success can become obsolete if they don't evolve. Natural selection rewards traits that fit the moment. Extinction clears the path for what comes next. Together, they form a feedback loop that never stops. What works today may not work tomorrow. In nature, in culture, and in everyday life, the world is shaped by a constant test: adapt or vanish. That's not a threat. It's a description of how things improve, survive, and move forward through time. Adaptation and the Red Queen effect. Being ahead today doesn't guarantee you'll stay ahead tomorrow. In evolution, as in life, the race never stops. Adaptation is the process by which organisms become better suited to their environments. Over generations, small changes in traits, like sharper claws, better camouflage, or faster reflexes, give certain individuals a survival edge. These traits become more common, and the species evolves. But adaptation doesn't happen in isolation. While one species adapts, others are adapting too. This leads to a phenomenon known as the Red Queen effect, named after a character in Alice in Wonderland who says, "It takes all the running you can do to stay in the same place." In evolutionary terms, it means that no matter how much progress a species makes, it must keep adapting just to maintain its current position in a constantly shifting landscape. Predators get faster, so prey must become more evasive. Parasites evolve, so hosts must strengthen their defenses. It's a never-ending arms race where standing still is falling behind. This idea extends far beyond biology. In business, companies that innovate slowly risk being overtaken by faster-moving competitors. In technology, today's breakthrough becomes tomorrow's baseline. Even in personal development, the skills that once set you apart can become outdated if you don't keep learning. The challenge is not just reaching success, it's staying relevant. That requires letting go of comfort, recognizing when your old strategies stop working, and being willing to change before you're forced to. The Red Queen effect reminds us that progress is relative. You're not just evolving in a vacuum, you're evolving in a system where everyone else is moving too. In such a world, the ability to adapt isn't a luxury, it's survival. Ecosystems. A forest isn't just a collection of trees, it's a living system, a web of plants, animals, microbes and nutrients, all interacting with one another. That's what makes it an ecosystem. An ecosystem is a community of living things, together with the non-living elements, like water, soil and climate, that shape their environment. Every part plays a role. Plants turn sunlight into food. Herbivores eat plants. Carnivores eat herbivores. Decomposers break down dead matter and return nutrients to the soil. Energy flows. Resources cycle. Nothing stands alone. But ecosystems aren't just about nature. The same structure shows up in human systems too. A business operates within a network of suppliers, customers, partners, and regulators. No company survives in isolation. Its success depends on how it fits and functions within a larger commercial ecosystem. Economies work the same way. Industries, workers, governments, and consumers are all parts of a broader system. When one part changes, like a new regulation or a sudden shortage, those changes ripple outward. A drought in one region might raise food prices across the globe. A supply chain disruption in one industry can slow down many others. The key feature of ecosystems is that they are interconnected. You can't tug on one thread without affecting others. That's why problems in ecosystems often have no simple fix. Intervening in one part can lead to unexpected consequences in another. You solve one issue, and a new one pops up somewhere else. Understanding ecosystems means shifting your focus from individual parts to patterns of interaction. It's not just what each element does, but how it relates to everything around it. In a world made up of systems within systems, it's this network thinking that helps explain why even small actions can have large and unpredictable impacts. Niches. Not every species needs to dominate the jungle. Some just need the right corner to call their own. In biology, a niche is the specific role a species plays in its ecosystem. It's more than just where it lives. It's what it eats, how it behaves, how it avoids predators, and how it fits into the larger web of life. One bird might feed on insects in tree bark, while another eats fruit in the canopy. They can live in the same forest without competing, because each has carved out a unique space where it thrives. This concept of a niche helps explain how ecosystems support so much diversity. Instead of one size fits all, nature specializes. Each species fills a role that makes the most of its strengths and limits overlap with others. That same principle shows up in the human world. In business, a niche is a focused segment of the market. Instead of trying to serve everyone, a niche company targets a specific group. Maybe it's high-performance running shoes for trail athletes, or eco-friendly pet products for urban dog owners. By narrowing their focus, these businesses can compete more effectively and deliver something that bigger, more generalized companies might overlook. In careers, finding your niche means leaning into your particular mix of skills and interests. You don't need to be good at everything, just the right things for the problems you're best equipped to solve. But niches can be fragile. Conditions change. A species that's perfectly adapted to one environment can struggle if that environment disappears. The same is true for businesses and individuals. Specialization brings advantages, but also dependencies. Success often means not only finding your niche, but being ready to adjust it as the world evolves. Flexibility, even within a narrow space, becomes the edge. Self-preservation. You don't have to teach a child to flinch at a loud noise or a lizard to dart away from danger. These reactions are built in. They come from one of the oldest instincts shared by all living things: self-preservation. At its core, self-preservation is the drive to survive. It's what makes animals flee from predators, what keeps plants turning toward the sun, and what causes bacteria to evolve resistance to threats like antibiotics. This instinct is not learned. It's wired into biology. Life, by definition, fights to stay alive. In humans, self-preservation is more complex. We protect our physical bodies, but also our mental health, social standing, and sense of identity. When someone questions our beliefs or criticizes our work, the discomfort we feel isn't just emotional, it's a kind of defense mechanism. Our sense of self is something we guard, often as carefully as we would guard our safety. This instinct is useful. It keeps us from walking into danger, taking reckless risks, or staying in harmful situations. But it can also hold us back. The same system that keeps us safe can make us overly cautious. We might avoid feedback because it feels threatening. We might resist change because it feels like risk. Over time, the desire to avoid harm can start to block growth. That's the trade-off. Self-preservation protects us from threats, but it can also make us resistant to challenge. The key is learning to distinguish real danger from imagined discomfort, knowing when that protective instinct is helpful and when it's just holding us in place. Self-preservation is not about never changing. It's about staying alive while adapting to the world. And that, for every species, is the ongoing challenge: to protect what matters while staying flexible enough to evolve. Replication. Every living thing is part of a chain, a copy of a copy that goes back billions of years. That chain exists because of one powerful process: replication. Replication is the mechanism by which life continues. At the molecular level, it's how DNA makes copies of itself so that cells can divide and organisms can reproduce. This process ensures that the genetic instructions for building and running a living organism are passed from one generation to the next. But replication isn't perfect, and that's a good thing. Tiny errors called mutations can occur during copying. Most are harmless, some are harmful, and a few turn out to be useful. These small differences are what natural selection works with. Without variation, species wouldn't be able to adapt to new environments. Replication preserves life, while its imperfections make evolution possible. The idea of replication goes beyond biology. In business, replication shows up when a successful model is scaled, like a restaurant franchise opening in new cities. In education, students begin by copying techniques before developing their own approach. Even in culture, ideas and behaviors spread by being repeated, often without much modification. Replication is also what makes things go viral. A single idea, video, or message can be shared millions of times, amplified by digital networks. But just like in biology, not every copy is beneficial. Misinformation, harmful trends, or outdated practices can also spread through replication. This is why replication requires intention. It's not just about making more of something. It's about deciding what to replicate and why. The best systems replicate what works, discard what doesn't, and stay open to improvement. Replication is how life, knowledge, and culture continue. But it's the ability to evolve within replication that makes progress possible. Cooperation. When people come together to lift a heavy object, something simple but powerful happens. They achieve something none of them could do alone. That's the core of cooperation. Cooperation is when individuals work together toward a shared goal, often sacrificing short-term gain for longer-term benefit. It shows up everywhere in nature. Ants build complex colonies. Wolves hunt in packs. Even cells in a multicellular organism cooperate to keep the body alive. At every level, teamwork increases the odds of survival. From an evolutionary standpoint, cooperation might seem strange. Why would one organism help another? The answer is reciprocity. When mutual benefit is possible, cooperation can outperform competition. If two animals work together to find food or defend a territory, they each gain more than they would on their own. When this kind of behavior is repeated over time, trust builds, and cooperation becomes the winning strategy. Humans have taken this principle further than any other species. We cooperate not just in small groups, but across cities, countries, and cultures. Our ability to share information, divide labor, and coordinate across large populations is what allowed us to build societies, technologies, and systems far beyond the reach of any individual effort. But cooperation doesn't happen automatically. It depends on certain conditions. There must be repeated interaction, clear benefits for all parties, and a way to discourage freeloaders, those who take without giving back. Rules, norms, and institutions help maintain cooperation by rewarding fairness and discouraging exploitation. Cooperation is the engine behind teamwork, community, and civilization. It scales human potential, turning isolated efforts into coordinated systems. When conditions support it, cooperation unlocks levels of progress that no one could reach alone. It's not just a moral ideal, it's a practical strategy for thriving in a complex world. Hierarchical organization. In any complex system, someone or something has to take the lead. That's where hierarchy comes in. Hierarchical organization is the structure where elements are ranked or arranged in levels, each with varying degrees of authority or function. It shows up everywhere, from nature to human institutions. In biology, cells form tissues, tissues form organs, and organs form systems. Each level depends on the one below, but also contributes to the larger whole. This structure isn't just about control, it allows for specialization. In an ant colony, the queen lays eggs, workers gather food, and soldiers defend the nest. No single ant understands the big picture, but the hierarchy allows the colony to function as a unified, efficient system. The same logic applies to companies, governments, and schools. A clear chain of command makes it easier to coordinate large groups, assign responsibilities, and resolve conflicts. Without structure, communication breaks down. With too much structure, creativity and flexibility suffer. The challenge is balancing order with adaptability. Importantly, hierarchy isn't always top-down or fixed. It's dynamic. A shift in one layer can impact the entire system. A policy change at the executive level can ripple through every department. A disruption at the bottom, like a supply chain failure, can destabilize the whole organization. The layers interact, influence, and adapt together. But hierarchy also comes with risks. If power becomes concentrated at the top, it can lead to inefficiency, resentment, or collapse. When people focus more on climbing the ladder than solving shared problems, the structure stops serving its purpose. Used wisely, hierarchical organization is a tool to manage complexity. It allows systems to grow, coordinate, and evolve while keeping parts aligned toward a shared goal. It's not about control for its own sake. It's about making large systems workable. Incentives. People rarely act without a reason, whether it's chasing a promotion, following a rule, or simply choosing what to eat. Most decisions are shaped by incentives. An incentive is anything that motivates behavior. It can be external, like a cash reward or a penalty. It can also be internal, like the satisfaction of mastering a skill or earning someone's respect. Incentives are how systems steer behavior, whether we realize it or not. Take a workplace, for example. If employees are rewarded for individual performance but asked to collaborate, the incentive pulls one way while the request points another. The result? Conflict, inefficiency, or even burnout. But when the incentive matches the desired outcome, like rewarding teams for collective results, cooperation becomes natural. Incentives work because they align with how our brains are wired. We're tuned to seek pleasure, recognition, or relief from discomfort. This works well in many situations. A student studies harder when a good grade is on the line. A company innovates faster when there's a clear competitive advantage. But incentives can also misfire. If a teacher is rewarded only for test scores, they may teach to the test instead of focusing on real understanding. If a company cuts costs to hit quarterly targets, it may sacrifice long-term stability. These examples show how incentives, when misaligned, can lead to unintended consequences. That's why the design of incentives matters. Good incentives guide people toward decisions that are both personally rewarding and systemically beneficial. Poor incentives encourage shortcuts, gaming the system, or behavior that looks good in the short term but causes problems later. Understanding incentives isn't just useful, it's essential. Whether you're managing a team, building a product, or shaping a policy, the outcomes you get will almost always follow the incentives you set. Tendency to minimize energy output. When faced with two options, most people will choose the easier one. This isn't laziness, it's biology. The tendency to minimize energy output is a basic principle that shows up across nature. It means that, when possible, systems will take the path of least resistance. A river flows downhill. Animals take the shortest route to food, and humans, wired for efficiency, often default to the simplest or most familiar solution. At its core, this is a survival mechanism. Conserving energy helped early humans survive in environments where food and resources were limited. Why burn calories you don't need to? Even today, our bodies and brains are built to optimize effort. We instinctively avoid unnecessary strain, whether it's physical work or mental effort. This tendency shows up in everyday choices. We reach for pre-made meals instead of cooking from scratch. We prefer scrolling short videos over reading in-depth articles. Even in thinking, we rely on familiar patterns instead of examining problems from new angles. The default is to do just enough, not necessarily because we're unmotivated, but because our brains are trying to conserve effort. But this built-in efficiency has a trade-off. Growth requires energy, learning, planning, reflecting. all of these are effort-heavy activities. If we always take the easy route, we miss opportunities to improve, adapt, or solve deeper problems. It's not that we lack the ability, it's that our wiring prefers to save the energy. Understanding this tendency can help us catch it in action. It explains why we procrastinate, why habits are hard to break, and why innovation often requires a deliberate push. The tendency to minimize energy output is powerful, but when recognized, it can be managed, turning a survival instinct into a tool for smarter effort and better decision-making. Feedback loops. When you speak into a microphone and hear your voice echo back through the speakers, you're experiencing a feedback loop. A feedback loop happens when the output of a system is fed back into the system as input. In simple terms, it's when the result of an action influences what happens next. This might sound technical, but feedback loops are everywhere, in nature, in technology, in personal habits, and in society. There are two main types, positive and negative. A positive feedback loop amplifies change. For example, when a microphone picks up its own sound from a speaker, the noise grows louder and louder until it screeches. In nature, melting ice exposes dark ocean water, which absorbs more heat and melts more ice. The cycle accelerates itself. A negative feedback loop does the opposite. It stabilizes. Think of a thermostat. When the room gets too hot, the air conditioning turns on. When it cools down, the system shuts off. The goal is balance. In biology, your body uses negative feedback to regulate temperature, blood sugar, and countless other functions. Feedback loops also shape human behavior. If you study, do well on a test, and feel proud, you're more likely to study again. That's a reinforcing loop. But if you touch a hot stove and feel pain, you learn not to repeat the action. That's corrective feedback. In either case, your actions adapt based on results. Understanding feedback loops is essential for improving systems. They explain how habits form, how businesses scale, and how environmental systems shift over time. Without feedback, there's no learning, no adjustment, and no progress. But with the right kind of feedback, change becomes guided, responsive, and sustainable. In any evolving system, feedback loops are the mechanism that makes adaptation possible. Equilibrium. Equilibrium is what happens when everything holds still, not because nothing is happening, but because all the forces pushing and pulling are perfectly balanced. In science, equilibrium is the state where opposing processes cancel each other out. Think of a seesaw with equal weight on both sides. Nothing moves, but there's still tension, an ongoing balance between forces. In chemistry, it's when a reaction is happening forward and backward at the same rate, so the overall concentration of substances stays constant. In biology, your body maintains internal equilibrium, or homeostasis, to keep your temperature, heart rate, and blood sugar within a narrow range. But equilibrium isn't just a scientific idea. It applies to markets, ecosystems, and even personal routines. Supply and demand in economics balance out at a price where buyers and sellers agree to trade. A stable ecosystem maintains equilibrium between predator and prey, plant growth and decay. And in daily life, people seek equilibrium between work and rest, stress and recovery. What's important to understand is that equilibrium is dynamic, not static. Systems are constantly adjusting, nudging back toward balance when something shifts. If your body overheats, it sweats. If prices spike, buyers back off. Equilibrium isn't a permanent destination. It's an ongoing process of correction. That also means equilibrium can sometimes be misleading. A system might appear stable while quietly building up pressure until it tips out of balance. Markets crash, ecosystems collapse, habits break down. So while equilibrium brings order, too much stability can prevent necessary change. In complex systems, knowing how equilibrium works helps you understand when to maintain balance and when to disrupt it. It's not just about standing still, it's about knowing when stillness is helpful and when motion is required to keep the system from drifting too far off course. Bottlenecks. Every system has a weakest point, a place where progress slows, frustration builds, and everything backs up. That's the bottleneck. A bottleneck is the part of a system that limits how fast the whole thing can operate. It might be a single step in a manufacturing process, a person in a team who's overwhelmed, or a slow connection in a data network. No matter how fast the rest of the system moves, everything still has to pass through that narrow opening. It's a simple concept, but its impact is massive. If you want to improve how something works, the most effective place to start isn't by speeding up everything. It's by identifying and improving the bottleneck. This is the foundation of the theory of constraints. The idea is straightforward. The slowest part of the system sets the pace for everything else. Fix that, and you'll see the biggest gains. Bottlenecks can also shift over time. You solve one, and another appears in a different part of the process. That's why systems need regular review. What worked yesterday might be what's holding you back today. But not all bottlenecks are problems. Sometimes they exist for a reason. A security checkpoint delays passengers, but it also protects them. A review step in a publishing process slows down output, but ensures accuracy. In cases like these, the bottleneck is a safeguard, not a flaw. Understanding bottlenecks helps you think clearly about efficiency, priorities, and flow. It's not about removing every obstacle, it's about knowing which ones matter. By focusing on the true constraint, you can create the most impact with the least effort. Scale. Scaling up isn't just about doing more, it's about doing differently. In any system, scale refers to size and capacity. Whether it's a business, a process, or a recipe, scaling means increasing output without everything falling apart. But here's the catch. Bigger doesn't just mean more of the same. It often means something else entirely. Take a simple example. Making pancakes. For a family of 4, you mix ingredients in a bowl and cook on a stovetop. But what if you're serving 400? You can't just multiply everything by 100 and hope for the best. You'll need industrial mixers, commercial griddles, and a team to manage the workflow. The recipe hasn't changed, but the process has. That's the core challenge of scale. What works at one level may completely break at another. A startup might thrive on informal communication and flexible roles. But as it grows, the lack of structure becomes a liability. Bottlenecks emerge. Decision-making slows down. Systems that felt seamless start to strain. To scale successfully, you have to anticipate the friction points. You need to recognize which parts of the system are fragile and redesign them to handle increased volume. Sometimes that means automation. Sometimes it means delegation or restructuring. Often it means letting go of what used to work. Importantly, scale doesn't always mean growing bigger. It can mean shrinking intelligently, focusing on what matters, trimming the excess, and tightening operations. Both directions require deliberate design. Thinking at scale is a mindset. It means asking not just, does this work now, but will this still work when it's 10 times bigger or smaller? Because in systems, growth isn't linear. And if you don't plan for scale, scale becomes the problem. Margin of safety. A good decision isn't just about being right, it's about staying safe even when you're wrong. That's the purpose of a margin of safety. A built-in buffer that protects you from the unexpected. It's the difference between a plan that barely works under perfect conditions and one that still holds up when things go sideways. You'll find this principle everywhere. Engineers don't design bridges to carry exactly the average load. They overbuild them, often by a large factor. Why? Because weather changes, traffic patterns shift, and errors happen. The extra strength isn't waste, it's insurance. In personal finance, a margin of safety might look like spending less than you earn or having an emergency fund. These aren't exciting moves. But when life throws a surprise expense your way, that buffer becomes the reason you stay afloat. In investing, the same logic applies. Buying something well below its estimated value gives you a cushion. If your estimate is off, you still have room before taking a loss. Without that gap, even a small mistake can become a big problem. Of course, margin of safety comes at a cost. You might use more resources than absolutely necessary. You might pass up opportunities that seem more aggressive, but that's the trade-off: short-term efficiency versus long-term resilience. Systems built without margin tend to work well until they don't. They collapse at the first sign of stress. The ones that last are designed with space to bend, not break. When uncertainty is part of the equation, margin of safety isn't optional. It's the quiet layer of protection that separates fragile from durable. Not because everything goes as planned, but because it rarely does. Churn. Churn is what happens when the people you worked hard to attract slowly start walking away. In business, churn usually refers to customer turnover, the percentage of users or clients who stop using your product or service over a given time. It's easy to focus on growth, on new sign-ups and expanding markets. But if your churn is high, that growth may be an illusion. You're pouring water into a bucket with a hole in the bottom. Churn isn't always loud. It rarely shows up in a single event. It's subtle. A missed renewal, a drop in usage, a quiet drift towards something better or simply easier. And it happens in more places than business. Employees leave companies. Friends fade out of your life. Subscribers unsubscribe. It's a universal pattern. People exit systems, and those systems must constantly adjust. But churn isn't always bad. In some cases, it's a healthy mechanism. Letting go of users who weren't a good fit can help you focus on the ones who are. Losing employees can open the door for better alignment. Even in ecosystems, species turnover helps balance the system over time. The key is to understand the balance. Too much churn and the system becomes unstable. Too little and it may stagnate. Smart systems account for churn. They track it, learn from it, and design for it. They focus not just on acquisition, but on retention, keeping the people they already have by consistently delivering value. Churn may not make headlines, but understanding it, where it happens, why it happens, and how to manage it is one of the clearest signs of whether something is truly built to last. Algorithms. Algorithms are everywhere, even if you don't notice them. At their core, an algorithm is just a set of instructions, a step-by-step process for solving a problem or completing a task. It's like a recipe. Add ingredients in a specific order, follow the timing, and you get a predictable result. But unlike recipes, algorithms are designed to be precise, repeatable, and efficient, especially when decisions need to be made quickly and consistently. In computer science, algorithms are the heart of every function. From sorting your emails to suggesting your next video, they decide what you see and when you see it. But the idea goes far beyond software. An algorithm is used whenever you follow a system. A teacher grading papers with a rubric is following an algorithm. A traffic light that changes based on sensors is running one too. The goal is to simplify complexity. Instead of making every decision from scratch, you use a rulebook that's been refined for results. That's why algorithms are so powerful. They scale decision-making, reduce randomness, and allow systems to handle massive amounts of data without falling apart. But algorithms also reflect the rules they're built on. If the rules are flawed or biased, the outcomes can be too. That's why understanding them is so important. They aren't magic, they're tools. Tools that amplify whatever logic they're given. Used well, algorithms can streamline systems, reduce errors, and help us make better decisions. Misused or misunderstood, they can quietly shape outcomes in ways no one sees until it's too late. Knowing how they work is no longer just a technical skill. It's a basic form of literacy in the modern world. Critical mass. In the beginning, progress can feel painfully slow, like pouring drops into a giant bucket and wondering if it will ever fill. But at some point, everything changes. That shift is what we call critical mass. Critical mass is the threshold where a system tips from unstable to self-sustaining. It comes from nuclear physics, where a certain amount of radioactive material is needed to trigger a chain reaction. But outside of science, it's a powerful way to understand change in everyday systems, social, economic, behavioral. In a workplace, a few people trying a new tool won't change much, but once enough employees adopt it, using it becomes the default. That's critical mass. In a social movement, a handful of voices might be easy to ignore. But when enough people show up, the conversation shifts. What was once marginal becomes mainstream. The same idea applies to personal habits. Flossing for 3 days feels like nothing, but after a few weeks, you cross a threshold. Habit replaces willpower. That's a micro version of critical mass. The key insight is that systems don't always respond proportionally. Adding one more unit of effort doesn't always create one more unit of change. But once the right conditions build up, a small addition can flip the whole system. This makes critical mass both a warning and an opportunity. If you're below the threshold, change feels stuck. But once you pass it, momentum takes over. What felt heavy now starts to move on its own. Understanding critical mass helps you think more clearly about timing, scale, and strategy. Whether you're trying to build something, influence behavior, or change direction, the challenge is often less about pushing harder and more about reaching the point where everything starts to push back. Emergence. A traffic jam isn't caused by one driver hitting the brakes. It's caused by many drivers, each reacting to the one in front. No single person plans it, but the jam still forms. That's emergence. Emergence is when simple parts combine to produce something new and often unexpected. It's not built in. It's not obvious from the parts themselves. But when enough pieces come together and interact in the right way, a new pattern appears. Think about an ant colony. A single ant follows basic rules: find food, avoid danger, follow trails. But when thousands of ants do this together, they build complex nests, organize labor, and adapt to their environment. No ant is in charge. The colony's intelligence is emergent. It comes from the interaction, not the individual parts. The same happens in the human brain. Neurons fire in patterns. Each one is a basic on-off switch. But when billions of them connect, thoughts emerge, consciousness emerges. You don't program a brain to think. It just happens when the right components link up. Emergence shows up in software, in cities, in ecosystems. A flock of birds moves like one shape in the sky, even though each bird only follows a few simple rules. The same applies to markets, cultures, and even language. No single person designs them. They emerge from interaction. What makes emergence powerful is that it scales. You don't need to understand or control the entire system. You just need to design the right local rules and let them play out. Sometimes, out of simplicity, comes something incredibly complex, and sometimes surprisingly elegant. Recognizing emergence helps us see patterns where we might otherwise see noise. It's a reminder that big things often grow not from a blueprint, but from small, local actions, repeated again and again. Irreducibility. Some things just don't make sense when you take them apart. That's the core of irreducibility. The idea that not everything can be explained by analyzing smaller pieces. In some systems, the whole is not just more than the sum of its parts. It's something entirely different. Take consciousness, for example. You can study neurons, brain chemistry, and electrical signals, but no single element tells you what it feels like to be alive. The experience only emerges when everything comes together. Break it down too far, and you lose what you're trying to understand. Irreducibility shows up in other places too. A city isn't just buildings, roads, and people. It's traffic patterns, culture, innovation, and tension, all unfolding through interaction. You can't predict how a city works by studying just one person or one street. This idea pushes back against the instinct to simplify everything. Sometimes complexity isn't a puzzle to be solved, but a reality to be respected. Certain problems, like climate change, human behavior, or markets, aren't broken because we haven't found the missing piece. They're hard to fix because they can't be reduced. They're made up of overlapping, shifting parts that change depending on how you look at them. That doesn't mean these problems are hopeless. It means the solution isn't always in the details. Sometimes you need to zoom out. Ask not what each part is doing, but how the whole behaves. Recognizing irreducibility helps you avoid wasting energy on oversimplified explanations. It encourages a more realistic, system-level view, one that accepts that not all complexity can be conquered, but it can be better understood. Law of diminishing returns. The first time you go to the gym after months of sitting at a desk, the changes can feel dramatic. A little effort leads to noticeable results, but keep going for months or years, and each improvement becomes smaller and harder to earn. That's the law of diminishing returns. It's a simple but powerful idea. When you invest more effort, time, or resources into something, your gains won't always increase at the same rate. At first, the returns are high. Then they begin to slow down. Eventually, you hit a point where adding more gives you very little in return. Imagine watering a plant. A few cups of water help it grow. But once the soil is saturated, more water doesn't make the plant grow faster. It just overflows. The same logic applies to learning a new skill, building a product, or even improving a business. At the start, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, easy wins that create big improvements. But as the system becomes more refined, each new tweak matters less. You can keep pouring in energy, but the payoff shrinks. This idea helps explain why perfection is so expensive. Getting something from 90% to 95% might take as much effort as it did to get from 0 to 90. That final push often costs the most and gives the least. The law of diminishing returns isn't about giving up. It's about knowing when the trade-off stops being worth it. It helps you make smarter decisions about where to invest effort, when to shift focus, and how to avoid chasing improvements that no longer matter. In any system, knowing when returns begin to shrink lets you manage time, energy, and resources with far more clarity. Sampling. Sampling is how we learn about the big picture, without needing to look at all of it. At its core, sampling means taking a smaller portion of something and using it to make sense of the whole. We do this all the time, often without thinking. Taste a spoonful of soup to check if it needs more salt. Watch a few minutes of a movie trailer to decide if it's worth seeing. The goal is efficiency, to gather useful insights without needing to examine every single piece. In science and statistics, sampling is a formal process. Suppose you want to know the average opinion of a population, like what people think about a new product. You don't ask every single person. Instead, you ask a carefully selected group that represents the whole. If done right, that group can tell you almost everything you need to know. But not all samples are useful. If your soup isn't stirred, one spoonful won't reflect the whole pot. If your survey only includes people from one neighborhood, it won't capture a city's full range of opinions. That's where sampling gets tricky, because biased samples lead to misleading conclusions. Larger samples usually give more reliable results, but they cost more time, money, and effort. That's why researchers work to find the smallest sample that still gives accurate answers. The goal is balance between precision and practicality. Sampling helps us make decisions under uncertainty. It's a tool for seeing patterns, making predictions, and forming judgments, without getting lost in the details. When used carefully, it reveals a lot with just a little. Randomness. Randomness is what happens when no one is in control, and no pattern can fully explain what's going on. It's the unexpected traffic jam on an empty road, the sudden downpour when the forecast promised sun, the lottery ticket that wins against 1,000,000 to 1 odds. In everyday life, randomness shows up as events that don't follow a clear cause and effect path. They just happen, and they're more common than we think. In statistics, randomness refers to outcomes that occur by chance, not design. Flip a fair coin, and you expect half heads, half tails over time, but you can't predict each flip. That's because each result is independent. There's no memory, no hidden system, just chance. But randomness doesn't mean chaos. In large numbers, random events follow predictable patterns. That's why casinos make money, insurance companies manage risk, and scientists rely on probability. When you zoom out far enough, randomness starts to reveal structure. The problem is that human brains aren't wired for randomness. We like cause and effect. We hunt for patterns, even where none exist. This makes us vulnerable to misjudging risk, chasing false trends, and blaming outcomes on factors that had no real influence. Randomness also plays a role in evolution, creativity, and innovation. Mutations are random. So are flashes of insight. Many breakthroughs emerge not from careful planning, but from trial, error, and luck. The unpredictable isn't always a flaw, it's sometimes a feature. Understanding randomness doesn't mean giving up control. It means recognizing its role, accounting for its effects, and learning to navigate a world where chance is part of the design. Regression to the mean, a streak of perfect scores, a slump that seems like it'll never end, a surprising win out of nowhere. When something feels too good or too bad to be true, there's a good chance you're seeing regression to the mean in action. This idea explains a simple but often misunderstood truth. Extreme outcomes tend to be followed by more average ones. It's not magic or karma, it's a statistical pattern. When an event is partly driven by chance, the next result usually won't be as far from the average. Let's say a student aces a test with a perfect score. That might reflect skill, but it also includes some good luck. Maybe the questions matched exactly what they studied. On the next test, that extra boost may not be there. They might still do well, but not quite as spectacularly. That dip isn't failure, It's a return to the norm. The same thing happens in sports. An athlete might have a breakout season that turns heads, but maintaining that level often proves difficult. They didn't suddenly become worse. It's just that the previous performance was unusually high, and the average is pulling things back down. Regression to the mean helps us avoid overreacting to outliers. It reminds us not to panic when something unusually bad happens, and not to get carried away by one-off success. Over time, patterns settle into balance. It's not about predicting individual moments, but about understanding trends. Whether you're analyzing stock markets, managing teams, or judging your own performance, recognizing this pull toward the average helps keep expectations grounded. It's a quiet force, often overlooked, but once you start seeing it, you can't unsee it. Multiply by 0. Even 1 0 can cancel everything else out. That's the idea behind multiply by 0. A principle that looks simple in math, but applies far beyond numbers. No matter how large or impressive a value is, if you multiply it by 0, the result is still 0. 1,000 times 0 is 0. 1,000,000 times 0, still 0. This is more than a math trick. It's a lens for spotting failure points in systems, habits, and even decision-making. Imagine spending years building a product, only to have one legal oversight get it pulled from the market. Or training for a marathon, only to get injured the day before because of one ignored warning sign. That's multiply by 0. One critical weak link can erase all progress. In real life, zeros often take the form of overlooked essentials, like trust in a relationship. If that's gone, the rest doesn't matter. Or sleep in your health routine. If you train and eat perfectly, but consistently sleep 3 hours a night, your body still breaks down. It doesn't matter how strong the rest of the system is, when even one crucial part fails completely. Understanding this concept means identifying the areas where failure can't be allowed. Not everything has to be perfect, but some things can't be neglected. Reliability, safety, legal compliance, ethics. These are 0 multipliers if ignored. They don't need to be the biggest parts of a system, but they do need to be working. Multiply by 0 is a reminder to think about the structure of success, not just the surface. It's not about adding more positives, it's about avoiding the one negative that can wipe everything out. Equivalence. Sometimes two things can look completely different and still serve the exact same function. That's the heart of equivalence, the idea that different elements can be swapped without changing the overall outcome. You see this in math when two equations have the same solution. You see it in coding when two different lines of code do the same job. And you see it in real life, like using a debit card or a credit card. Different tools, but the end result is a payment. Equivalence helps us simplify complex systems by identifying what actually matters. If two parts of a system lead to the same outcome, they're equivalent, even if they look or feel different. This lets us swap things out, reorganize or rethink problems without getting lost in the details. For example, imagine you're building furniture. Whether you use a flathead or a Phillips screwdriver, you're still tightening the screw. One might be more convenient, but both are functionally equivalent. Knowing this saves time and stress. You don't have to search endlessly for a perfect tool if a good enough one does the job. But equivalence doesn't mean everything is interchangeable. There's a difference between what's essential and what's cosmetic. You can replace flour with almond flour in a recipe. That might work. Replace it with sand. Now you're in trouble. The skill lies in knowing what variables you can change without throwing everything off. Understanding equivalence gives you flexibility. It helps you find shortcuts that don't cut corners. It helps you see what's truly necessary and what's just decoration. When used well, it becomes a mental model for creative problem solving, showing that different paths can still lead to the same destination. Surface area. How much you touch the world and how much the world touches you often comes down to surface area. Surface area is a measure of exposure. In science, it refers to how much outer space an object has for interaction. A crushed ice cube, for instance, melts faster than a solid block because more of it is exposed to heat. The same logic applies far beyond physics. In business, surface area might refer to how many customers you serve, how many platforms you're active on, or how many touch points you have with the market. More surface area can mean more opportunity for growth, but it also means more places where things can go wrong. In personal life, increasing your surface area might look like trying new experiences, meeting more people, or opening yourself up to feedback. This can lead to faster learning, broader perspective, and creative breakthroughs. But there's a trade-off. More exposure also means more risk of failure, rejection, or distraction. Reducing surface area can be powerful too. Think of a submarine. It's built to minimize exposure, keeping internal systems insulated from crushing pressure. In some moments, that's exactly what you need. Tight focus, minimal input, zero distractions. So, the idea of surface area gives us a way to think about interaction versus insulation. Do you want to absorb more or protect more? There's no single answer. It depends on what you're building and what you're protecting it from. Understanding surface area means understanding the points of contact between you and the systems you're part of. It's not about always increasing or decreasing exposure, but about adjusting it intentionally, depending on what you need to grow, adapt, or endure. Global and local maxima. In problem solving and decision making, the concept of global and local maxima helps explain why good enough can sometimes keep us from discovering what's truly better. A local maximum is a peak, just not the highest one. It's a point where things seem optimal from your current position, but there could be a higher peak somewhere else on the map. Imagine you're hiking in fog. You climb a hill and reach the top. It feels like success. But because your view is limited, you don't realize there's a much taller mountain just beyond your field of vision. That's the difference between a local and a global maximum. This concept shows up in everything from software optimization to career planning. A company might settle on a decent product design because it works well enough. But in doing so, they may overlook an entirely different approach that could have worked even better. Likewise, someone might stick with a familiar routine because it brings predictable results, even if it caps their long-term growth. The challenge is that moving toward a global maximum sometimes means stepping down first, letting go of a good option in order to explore riskier terrain. That dip can feel uncomfortable. It means leaving behind comfort for uncertainty, at least for a while. But understanding the terrain helps. The idea of global and local maxima reminds us that improvement isn't always a smooth incline. It's full of false peaks, detours, and recalculations. If we stop too early, we might miss the chance to find something far more rewarding than what we already have. Scarcity. Scarcity is one of the first forces we ever encounter. As kids, it's the toy that everyone wants because only one is left on the shelf. As adults, it's time, energy, or resources, never enough of them, always something to manage. In its simplest form, scarcity just means limited supply. When something is scarce, its value tends to go up. If there are only a few concert tickets left, people scramble to buy. If there's only one job opening, competition spikes. Scarcity creates urgency, and urgency shapes behavior. Economics is built on this principle. Our wants are endless, but our means are limited. So every decision is a trade-off. When we spend money or time on one thing, we're giving up something else. Scarcity forces choice, and choice drives systems. But scarcity doesn't just apply to products and services. It applies to attention, trust, creativity. If your day is packed with meetings, free time becomes scarce, and suddenly it feels more precious. Or consider skills. A rare combination of traits, like creativity and discipline, or logic and empathy, can make a person uniquely valuable in the job market. Scarcity also affects how we build systems. Some organizations operate with tight inventories or bare-bones teams to stay lean and efficient. But this kind of scarcity can make a system fragile. When something goes wrong, there's no slack, no cushion, just consequences. And then there's artificial scarcity, limited editions, timed offers, members-only access. These strategies can boost demand by tapping into our deep-rooted fear of missing out. But the thing to remember is, scarcity isn't always a sign of real value. Sometimes it's manufactured, sometimes it's marketing. Understanding scarcity, real or perceived, helps us see how it influences choices, competition, and even our sense of what matters. Supply and demand. Prices don't just appear out of thin air. They emerge from a constant tug-of-war between supply and demand, the two forces that quietly shape everything from what you pay for groceries to how entire industries rise and fall. Supply is how much of something is available. Demand is how much people want it. When demand rises and supply stays flat, prices tend to go up. When supply floods the market but demand is weak, prices usually fall. This interaction forms the backbone of how markets function. Take housing, for example. If a city experiences a population boom but doesn't build enough new homes, demand outpaces supply. Rents skyrocket. But if construction ramps up and thousands of new apartments are built, supply catches up, and prices can stabilize or drop. This principle applies everywhere, from job markets to energy to limited edition sneakers. When there's a mismatch between how much is available and how much people want, the system reacts. That reaction is what guides resource allocation. Products flow to those who are most willing or able to pay. But supply and demand don't operate in a vacuum. They respond to expectations, trends, and emotion. In a booming market, excitement and speculation can push demand higher than logic would suggest. In a downturn, fear can suppress demand even when supply is abundant. These fluctuations drive business cycles, expansion, saturation, contraction, and they're as much psychological as they are material. Importantly, we all play a role in this system. When you choose to buy something, hold off, invest, or switch preferences, you're signaling demand. When businesses ramp up production or cut back, they're adjusting supply. Supply and demand isn't just an economic model. It's a reflection of collective behavior, playing out across every transaction, every day. Optimization. Optimization is what happens when you stop doing things the hard way. It's the process of fine-tuning a system, any system, to get the best possible result using the least possible waste. Whether it's saving time, cutting costs, or improving performance, optimization is about making smarter use of what's already there. At its core, optimization means finding the most efficient path to a goal. It's used everywhere, from engineers reducing fuel use in rockets to someone figuring out the quickest route through rush hour traffic. If you've ever rearranged your morning routine to save 10 minutes, you've already used it. In business, Optimization can mean streamlining operations, automating tasks, or reallocating resources. In health, it might involve adjusting a diet or workout plan to get better results without burning out. And in tech, algorithms constantly optimize data flow, user experience, and even ad targeting. But optimization has limits. If you focus only on making something faster or cheaper, you might overlook things like reliability, resilience, or long-term value. That's when over-optimization becomes a trap. For example, a company that cuts too many safety checks to save time might see short-term gains, but at the cost of long-term stability. There's also the danger of optimizing for the wrong goal. If you optimize social media content only for clicks, you might end up with headlines that grab attention but deliver little value. The system becomes efficient at doing the wrong thing. True optimization isn't just about speed or numbers. It's about aligning effort with purpose, finding the sweet spot where effort, quality, and outcome meet. When used wisely, optimization helps us get more out of less, spot what's working, and sharpen what isn't. It turns guesswork into strategy and chaos into control. Trade-offs. Trade-offs are built into everything we do. You only have so much time, money, or energy, and every decision you make comes at the expense of something else. Whether you notice it or not, every choice is a negotiation. At its simplest, a trade-off is when you give up one thing to gain another. If you spend your evening relaxing, that's time you're not spending working. If you pour resources into speed, you might sacrifice quality. It's the rule behind every tough decision. You can't have it all at once. In economics, this idea is captured by opportunity cost, what you miss out on when you pick one option over another. But trade-offs aren't just about efficiency or dollars. They're also emotional, creative, and deeply personal. A demanding career might bring prestige, but leave little time for family. A simple lifestyle may cost you luxury, but bring peace of mind. There's no universal formula for the right choice. It depends on what you value. You'll see trade-offs everywhere. In product design, where a phone can be fast, cheap, or durable, but usually not all three. In relationships, where compromise means letting go of some preferences for the sake of connection. Even in daily routines, like choosing between more sleep or more time to prepare in the morning. What makes trade-offs powerful isn't just recognizing that they exist. It's learning to navigate them wisely. That means understanding your priorities, knowing what really matters, and accepting that every gain comes with a cost. There's no avoiding trade-offs, but by acknowledging them and approaching them with intention, you gain clarity. You stop chasing everything and start choosing better. Not perfect, just better. That's how progress works, and that's how we build a life that actually fits. Specialization. Specialization is what happens when you stop trying to do everything and start getting really good at one thing. It's how people become brain surgeons instead of general doctors, or concert pianists instead of casual musicians. In a world full of complexity, focus becomes a powerful tool. At its core, specialization means narrowing your scope so you can deepen your skill. Instead of spreading yourself across 10 tasks, you double down on one. That might mean learning the fine points of tax law or mastering one specific programming language. It's a trade-off. By going deep in one area, you give up breadth in others. The benefit is efficiency. When someone specializes, they get faster, better, and more accurate at what they do. A bakery that only makes sourdough is likely to bake better sourdough than one juggling 50 kinds of bread. Over time, this focus compounds into expertise, and expertise stands out. But specialization has downsides. when the world shifts, specialized knowledge can become less useful. If you've trained your whole life for one task, and that task disappears, it's hard to adapt. That's why flexibility still matters. Many breakthroughs happen at the edges, where different fields meet. A biologist who understands data science, or a designer who knows psychology, can see things others miss. So the real art of specialization isn't just going deep. It's knowing how and when to look sideways. The goal is to be rooted in one area while staying open to influence from others. Specialization builds mastery, but mastery doesn't mean isolation. It means choosing where to dig and knowing how to connect what you find. That's how individuals push boundaries, solve hard problems, and make a lasting impact. Interdependence. Interdependence is everywhere. You just have to zoom out far enough to see it. From the food on your plate to the phone in your pocket, nearly everything you touch exists because countless people, systems, and processes work together behind the scenes. Interdependence means mutual reliance. It's when different parts of a system depend on one another to function well. In nature, it's the relationship between bees and flowers. In cities, it's the link between workers, businesses, infrastructure, and governance. In daily life, it's how families, friends, and co-workers support one another in ways that often go unnoticed. No one grows all their food, builds their home, manufactures their clothes, and repairs their own technology. And no business survives in a vacuum. Supply chains, customers, and collaborators form an ecosystem of constant give and take. Even nations with strong economies rely on others for resources, labor, and trade. Interdependence is not a sign of weakness. It's a feature of complex systems. This kind of connectivity can create strength through collaboration. When people or groups coordinate well, they can achieve more than they ever could alone. That's how global teams build software, or how hospitals run with help from hundreds of roles working in sync. But interdependence also brings risk. A delay in one part of the system can disrupt the rest. That's why building trust and flexibility into relationships is so important. On a personal level, interdependence shapes how we live. Relationships thrive not from total independence, but from a healthy balance of autonomy and support. We rely on others, and they rely on us. The goal isn't to eliminate dependence, but to manage it wisely, acknowledging that our connections, when chosen carefully and nurtured well, can make us stronger, not weaker. Efficiency. Efficiency is about making things work, faster, smoother, and with less waste. It's what turns long lines into short ones, complex workflows into simple steps, and chaos into order. Whether you're cooking dinner, running a business, or writing code, efficiency is what helps you get more done with fewer resources. At its core, efficiency means achieving a desired outcome with the least input, less time, less energy, less money. It's the opposite of spinning your wheels. A well-organized toolbox lets a mechanic work faster. A streamlined assembly line lowers costs. A clean calendar helps you focus. Efficiency isn't always flashy, but it's powerful. But efficiency isn't just about speed. It's about doing the right things in the right way. You can be fast and still wasteful if you're chasing the wrong goal. True efficiency includes effectiveness. That means prioritizing tasks that matter and letting go of distractions that don't. It's about asking, what's worth optimizing? However, efficiency comes with trade-offs. Over-optimize a system, and it may lose its resilience. A factory might run lean with no backup supplies, but a single disruption can shut it down. A company might cut headcount to save costs, only to find it can't respond when demand surges. Perfect efficiency leaves no slack, and sometimes a little slack is what keeps things stable. That's where long-term thinking matters. Short-term efficiency can weaken your ability to adapt. Leaving room for redundancy, backup plans, and flexibility can seem inefficient in the moment, but it's often the best insurance against surprise. Efficiency, then, is not a race to the bottom. It's a thoughtful balance, simplifying where you can, streamlining what matters, and preserving enough space to handle what's next. Debt. Debt is borrowing from the future to solve a problem today. It can open doors or lock them shut, depending on how it's used. A loan can fund a college education, a new business, or a first home. It can be the boost that turns potential into progress. But every borrowed dollar comes with a promise. You'll pay it back, often with interest. At its core, debt is an exchange of time. You're choosing to bring forward the benefit of something now, in return for smaller sacrifices stretched out over time. That's not always a bad trade. In fact, most modern economies run on this principle. Governments borrow to build infrastructure. Companies borrow to grow. Individuals borrow to invest in their futures. But debt comes with weight. The more you owe, the less flexible you become. An unexpected emergency, a missed paycheck, or rising interest rates can turn a manageable debt into a mounting burden. And not all debt is financial. You can owe time, energy, or emotional bandwidth. Promises, favors, and even delayed rest, like sleep debt, can pile up in similar ways. The risk with debt is that it assumes stability. It bets on everything going according to plan. But plans change. Life is unpredictable. The more you borrow against the future, the less room you have to adjust when the unexpected shows up. Still, debt isn't inherently dangerous. Used thoughtfully, it's a tool for growth. But like any tool, it requires care. The key is understanding the cost, not just the payment terms, but the limits it places on your freedom, your resilience, and your peace of mind. Debt amplifies whatever direction you're headed. If you're climbing, it can give you a boost. But if you're falling, it makes the crash much harder. Monopoly and competition. In every marketplace, two forces are always at play: monopoly and competition. One drives variety and innovation. The other controls, consolidates, and dominates. Competition is what happens when multiple players offer similar products or services, all trying to win the customer's attention. No single business gets to call the shots. Prices are set by the market, and companies survive by being better, cheaper, or faster than the rest. It's a constant pressure cooker, but that's what keeps businesses sharp. You see this in everyday life. Supermarkets battling over discounts, tech companies racing to launch the next big feature, local restaurants fighting for regulars. Monopoly, on the other hand, is what happens when a single firm takes control. It could be through patents, exclusive access to resources, or just being first and fastest. In a monopoly, the company isn't just participating in the market, it is the market. There's little need to compete because the alternatives don't exist. The upside: monopolies can afford to take big risks, invest in long-term research, or offer consistent service. The downside? Without pressure to compete, service can suffer, prices can rise, and innovation can slow. Both forces shape how industries evolve. New ideas often start in competitive environments where many try and fail. But when one of those ideas takes off and dominates, it can tip into monopoly. That monopoly might last for years, until someone else finds a better way and restarts the cycle. Understanding the push and pull between monopoly and competition helps explain why some products improve rapidly, while others barely change. It explains pricing, customer service, and even the pace of progress. At its heart, it's a tension between control and choice. And that tension is what drives the business world forward. Creative destruction. Creative destruction is what happens when the new makes way by breaking down the old. It sounds harsh, but it's one of the main reasons industries evolve, technologies improve, and economies grow. At its core, creative destruction is the process of innovation replacing tradition. A better idea shows up, and the old system gets pushed aside. It's how cars replaced horses, how digital cameras wiped out film, how smartphones made payphones vanish. Something is lost, but something better usually takes its place. This cycle isn't smooth. When a business model fails, jobs can disappear. Entire industries can vanish. But from an economic perspective, this isn't a bug, it's a feature. Creative destruction frees up resources, talent, and energy to flow toward new, more productive uses. The rise of ride-sharing apps didn't just hurt taxi companies, it also gave millions of people flexible ways to earn income. The tricky part is that this kind of change doesn't ask for permission. It happens whether we're ready or not. Companies that rest on past success get caught off guard. Blockbuster didn't adapt fast enough. Kodak invented the digital camera, but hesitated to act. And while the cost of destruction is real, the failure to innovate can be even more damaging in the long run. Creative destruction is a constant cycle. New ideas start small, challenge the status quo, and, if they prove useful, grow fast. It keeps markets competitive and prevents stagnation. In a way, it's the economy's immune system, tearing down what no longer works to make space for what might. It's a messy process, but without it, progress slows, systems decay, and opportunities dry up. Creative destruction might be uncomfortable, but it's also what keeps everything moving forward. Gresham's law. Gresham's law is one of those ideas that starts with money, but quickly reveals something deeper about human behavior. It's the principle that bad money drives out good. In simple terms, when two types of money are treated as equal in value by law, but one is actually worth more, people tend to hoard the good one and spend the bad one. Over time, the good money disappears from circulation. Imagine you're living in a time when both silver coins and paper notes are accepted as currency. The silver has real metal value, while the paper just has a promise. Which one are you more likely to hold on to? Most people would keep the silver and spend the paper. That's Gresham's law in action. But this idea doesn't stop at coins. It applies to any system where quality competes with convenience. In a marketplace, when low-quality goods are sold for the same price as high-quality ones, people save the good stuff and flood the market with the bad. Over time, the average quality drops. It can happen in lending too. Risky loans crowd out responsible ones because they offer faster returns. In conversations, loud opinions drown out thoughtful ones. In organizations, cutting corners can become the norm if it saves time or money, until standards quietly slip away. Gresham's law shows how systems can decay when there's no strong feedback loop to protect quality. If we can get away with offering less and receiving the same reward, many will. The good gets sidelined, not because it's useless, but because it's too valuable to risk. Understanding this pattern helps explain why certain industries decline, why trust erodes, and why genuine quality so often feels rare. It's not just an economic rule, it's a warning worth paying attention to. Bubbles. Bubbles happen when excitement outpaces reality. In financial terms, A bubble is when the price of something, stocks, real estate, cryptocurrency, soars far above its actual worth. And it doesn't stop because people think it might be overvalued. It keeps rising because everyone believes someone else will pay even more tomorrow. At first, it looks like opportunity. Early investors make quick profits. News spreads. More people pile in. The price goes up because it's going up, not because anything real has changed underneath. This is how bubbles inflate, fueled by momentum, optimism, and a deep fear of missing out. But bubbles aren't just about money. They're about psychology. When everyone around you is profiting, sitting out starts to feel like a mistake. Rational judgment gets replaced by group enthusiasm. People convince themselves that the old rules don't apply, that this time is different, until it isn't. Eventually, something triggers doubt. Maybe the first few people sell. Maybe bad news breaks. And because the price was built on belief rather than value, the reversal is sudden. When that belief fades, demand vanishes, and the collapse is fast. The bubble bursts. The dot-com crash, the housing market collapse, even the tulip mania of the 1600s, all follow this same pattern. Rising optimism, mass participation, then sudden panic. But interestingly, bubbles also drive progress. They fund experiments, build infrastructure, and push technology forward. Many innovations owe their start to these frenzied booms. Still, bubbles remind us that markets aren't purely logical. They reflect human emotion just as much as economic fundamentals. The trick is knowing when excitement is leading the way and when it's time to step back before the pop. Audience. An audience might seem passive, people watching, listening, reading, but in reality, they're part of the performance. The audience isn't just receiving something, they're completing it. Every film, book, painting, or song reaches its full form only when someone engages with it. Without them, the work is unfinished. At its core, the concept of audience is about interpretation. A single message can land in 100 different ways, depending on who's receiving it. A comedian's joke might make one person laugh and another wince. A movie scene might be inspiring to one and cliché to another. The audience brings their own experiences, beliefs, and emotions, and these shape the meaning. That's why creators pay so much attention to who they're speaking to. Understanding your audience means understanding how to be heard. It's the reason a teacher changes tone for second graders versus college students. It's why companies tailor ads differently for teenagers and retirees. The message might be the same, but the packaging changes. But there's a balance. Cater too much to your audience, and the message loses authenticity. Ignore them entirely, and it risks irrelevance. The best communicators keep both in mind. They know when to challenge and when to resonate. Audience awareness isn't just for artists or marketers. It plays a role in every conversation, every pitch, every argument. Knowing who's on the other side helps you adjust not just what you say, but how you say it. And that can be the difference between being understood or ignored. Genre. Genre is the silent agreement between the creator and the audience. Without saying a word, it sets expectations. A book with dragons and spells cues us for fantasy. A film with courtroom tension tells us it's a legal drama. Genre is the shortcut that helps us navigate the infinite sea of stories and styles. At its core, genre is a system of patterns. These patterns tell us what to expect, whether it's a structure, a mood, or a set of familiar tropes. A horror movie builds dread. A romantic comedy brings charm and resolution. These aren't just formulas, they're frameworks. They offer both guidance and boundaries. For creators, genre is both a tool and a challenge. On one hand, It provides a structure to build from. On the other, it sets limits. Stick too closely to the formula, and the work risks feeling stale. Break the rules too much, and it might not make sense to the intended audience. The trick is to find the balance, to honor the form while bending it just enough to feel original. Genres also evolve. What used to define a category changes over time. The science fiction of the 1950s, filled with aliens and rocket ships, gave way to philosophical explorations of identity and consciousness. Genres split, merge, and reinvent themselves. Today, many of the most compelling works sit between genres, borrowing freely to create something new. For the audience, genre helps us choose. It helps us decide what kind of experience we're looking for. And for artists, it's a way to connect, signaling not just what a work is, but how it should feel. Genre, at its best, is a shared language. Not a cage, but a launchpad. Contrast. Contrast is what makes anything stand out. Whether it's a bold color on a blank wall or a quiet moment in a noisy crowd, our brains are hardwired to notice differences. Without contrast, everything blends together. Nothing catches your eye, nothing holds your attention. It's the differences, not the similarities, that create impact. In visual design, contrast helps organize information. A black headline on a white page is easy to read because the contrast is high. If the text were light grey on white, it would feel harder to process. The same goes for shapes, sizes, and spacing. A single large object surrounded by smaller ones draws your eye first. It's a natural instinct. But contrast isn't limited to visuals. In music, a slow build makes a sudden drop hit harder. In storytelling, a quiet scene can make the chaos that follows feel more intense. A happy ending means more after a painful struggle. Without the lows, the highs wouldn't feel as high. Contrast also helps clarify ideas. Comparing two opposing perspectives makes each one easier to understand. When one character in a story is cautious and the other reckless, their personalities become more vivid through the comparison. It's contrast that gives them shape. Even in daily life, contrast shapes experience. A cold drink feels better on a hot day. A moment of silence feels deeper after constant noise. We don't just experience things in isolation. We experience them in relation to what came before. Contrast is everywhere. It's how we define, prioritize, and feel. It helps us make sense of the world, not by showing us everything at once, but by showing us difference, side by side. Framing. Framing is about more than what you say, it's how you say it. The same information can feel encouraging or alarming depending on the angle it's presented from. That's the power of framing. It shapes perception without changing the facts. At its core, framing is context. It's the difference between calling a meal 90% fat-free versus 10% fat. Both statements are true, but one feels healthier. Politicians, marketers, journalists, even everyday people use framing, sometimes intentionally, sometimes without realizing it. And because our brains tend to take mental shortcuts, these subtle shifts in presentation can heavily influence how we think, decide, or feel. Framing plays a central role in decision-making. Psychologists have shown that people respond differently to the same choices when framed as gains versus losses. For example, a medical treatment with a 70% success rate sounds reassuring. But if you describe it as having a 30% failure rate, people hesitate. The numbers are identical, but the reactions are not. In business, a product can be framed as a tool for productivity or as a badge of prestige. The object doesn't change, only the story surrounding it. That story affects how we see its value, and where we think it belongs in our lives. Framing also affects how we interpret complex events. Headlines can frame a protest as a public disturbance or a fight for justice. The words guide how we judge the situation, often before we consciously process what happened. We all use mental frames, shaped by culture, experience, and belief, to make sense of the world. But these frames are not fixed. Recognizing how framing works helps us ask better questions, think more clearly, and communicate more thoughtfully. Because often, the frame makes more impact than the picture itself. Rhythm. Rhythm is everywhere. You feel it in your steps, in your breath, in the ticking of a clock. It's not just part of music, it's how we organize time, movement, and experience. In music, rhythm is the structure that holds everything together. It's the beat you tap your foot to, the pulse that lets different instruments play in sync. Whether it's a steady drum pattern or a complex jazz groove, rhythm gives music its shape. Without it, notes lose their timing, and emotion loses its punch. But rhythm isn't limited to sound. It's a principle that shows up across many aspects of life. In language, for example, rhythm helps create impact. The pacing of a speech, the pauses between lines, the meter of a poem. These aren't just stylistic choices. They guide attention, build tension, and influence how we feel and remember what's being said. Even in visual art, rhythm matters. Repetition, spacing, and flow guide the viewer's eye across a painting or a photograph. Designers use visual rhythm to control how we experience a piece, from calm and balanced to fast and chaotic. Daily routines also follow rhythms: work and rest, activity and recovery, focus and distraction. They form cycles that repeat over time. When your rhythms are stable, life feels manageable. When they're disrupted, even simple tasks can become overwhelming. What makes rhythm powerful isn't just its regularity, but its contrast. We notice the beat because of the silence between notes. We recognize a pattern because it deviates just enough to stay interesting. Rhythm is how we turn moments into meaning and chaos into something we can follow. Melody. Melody is what we carry with us long after the music stops. It's the part we hum without thinking, the tune that loops in our heads while walking down the street or waiting in line. More than any beat or chord, it's melody that sticks. Because melody is how music tells a story. At its core, a melody is just a sequence of notes, arranged in time. But what makes one melody forgettable and another unforgettable comes down to shape, rhythm, and emotional movement. It might rise gradually, creating a sense of hope. It might fall slowly, evoking loss or reflection. A melody can leap unpredictably or flow smoothly, depending on the feeling it aims to express. We often don't realize how naturally our brains respond to melody. We recognize patterns, anticipate resolutions, and notice when something feels off. This sense of musical direction, of tension and release, is what makes a melody feel alive. It's not just sound, it's motion. It has a beginning, a journey, and an end. Importantly, melody isn't confined to any single culture or time period. Whether it's a folk song from centuries ago or a chart-topping pop single, the emotional logic of melody remains largely the same. People respond to it, often without needing to know the lyrics or background. A good melody crosses borders without needing to explain itself. It's also one of music's most personal elements. The same melody can make one person nostalgic and another joyful. That emotional ambiguity is part of its power. Melody speaks the way a glance or a gesture might, without words, but full of meaning. In the noise of everyday life, melody is one of the clearest ways we connect, to music, to memory, and to each other. Representation. Representation is how we turn the world into something we can understand. Whether it's a roadmap, a photo, or a word on a page, representation is the act of standing in for something else, something more complex, more detailed, or more abstract than we can process all at once. When you look at a subway map, you're not seeing the city's actual geography. You're seeing a simplified model designed to help you navigate. The same is true for most of what we interact with: diagrams, signs, language, art. We use these tools to shrink reality into something we can carry in our minds. But every representation makes choices. It keeps some things and leaves others out. A graph might highlight trends while hiding outliers. A painting might capture mood but ignore context. Even language, which feels automatic, simplifies the richness of experience into categories we can name and share. That's where things get complicated. Representations shape how we see the world. A news headline can frame a protest as either a riot or a movement. A statistic can clarify or mislead. An emoji can suggest an emotion, but not explain the story behind it. These choices, what's included, what's left out, can have real consequences. Representation also has power beyond communication. It can influence how people see themselves and each other. Seeing someone like you in a film, a book, or a position of authority can affect what you believe is possible, and the absence of that representation can do the opposite. At its core, representation isn't just about describing reality. It's about shaping how we think, feel, and act within it. It's one of the most basic tools we use to make sense of the world and to decide what kind of world we want to live in. Plot. A plot is what turns a collection of events into a story. Without it, all you have are disconnected scenes. With it, you get momentum, a reason to keep turning the page or watching the screen. Plot gives structure to storytelling. It links cause and effect, decision and consequence, challenge and growth. At its simplest, a plot is a sequence. Something happens, and because of that, something else happens. It's the chain reaction that drives the story forward. A character makes a choice. That choice leads to consequences, and those consequences force the next move. This chain continues until the story reaches some kind of resolution, whether it's a win, a loss, or something in between. But plot isn't just a checklist of events. What gives it life is conflict. Conflict creates stakes. It forces characters to act, to adapt, and to reveal who they are under pressure. This could be a fight against an enemy, a struggle with nature, a clash with society, or an internal battle with fear or guilt. Whatever form it takes, conflict is what makes the story matter. A good plot doesn't just change the situation, it changes the character. Through the course of events, the character is tested. They confront problems that require them to grow or fail trying. That transformation is what makes a plot feel satisfying. The best stories end with someone who isn't the same as when they started. Plot also shapes how we make sense of our own lives. We tell ourselves stories to explain why things happen, where we're going, and who we are. The plots we create in our minds influence our actions, just like the ones we watch in movies or read in books. Understanding plot means understanding the mechanics behind how stories work and why they're so powerful. Character. Character is what turns a name on a page into someone we care about. It's what makes stories feel human. Plot tells us what happens, but character tells us why it matters. Every great story depends on someone the audience can understand, follow, and feel something for, even if they disagree with their choices. At its most basic level, a character is a person, or something personified, driven by wants, fears, and beliefs. These motivations influence what they do, how they react, and what kind of path they take through the story. A brave character tackles a challenge head-on. A fearful one hesitates. A selfish one might put others at risk, while a loyal one sacrifices themselves. The way a character behaves under pressure gives the audience insight into who they are. But characters aren't just defined by traits. They're defined by change. A compelling character doesn't just move through the plot. They're affected by it. The best stories show a transformation, whether it's a moral awakening, a slow descent, or a hard-won lesson. This change makes the story feel like it went somewhere meaningful. Characters also give structure to stories. Conflict happens when a character's goals meet resistance. Their choices shape the direction of the plot, and their reactions add emotion to every twist. A story about survival feels different when told through the eyes of a soldier, a child, or a criminal, not because the situation changes, but because the person does. Understanding character isn't just about fiction. In real life, we build narratives around people the same way. We watch actions, look for patterns, and try to predict what someone will do next. Whether on the screen or in the real world, character helps us make sense of behavior, relationships, and decisions. It's how we turn people into stories, and stories into something worth remembering. Setting, where a story takes place, can be just as important as what happens in it. That's the role of setting. It's the backdrop, the context, and sometimes even a character in its own right. Setting tells us where we are, when we are, and what kind of world the characters are living in. At the surface level, setting includes location, time period, weather, and atmosphere. But it goes deeper. It also includes the social norms, technologies, politics, and even the emotional tone of a place. A story set during wartime, for example, brings with it a sense of urgency and danger. A story set in a quiet suburb might suggest routine, stability, or underlying tension. Setting shapes the possibilities of the story. It sets the rules. In a high-tech future, a character might solve problems with artificial intelligence. In a historical drama, they're bound by the customs and tools of their time. The same decision can carry wildly different consequences depending on where and when it's made. Good settings also influence how we perceive the characters. A person who thrives in a chaotic city might struggle in a rural town. Someone who appears confident in a crowd might feel lost in solitude. The setting pressures the character, tests them, and reveals who they really are. And it's not a one-way interaction. Characters don't just adapt to their environments, they change them. A new sheriff reshapes a lawless town. A curious child alters the dynamic of a quiet household. Setting and character work together to drive the story forward. In storytelling, setting is more than scenery. It's structure, it's tone, and it's a powerful source of tension and meaning. Understanding it isn't just about imagining a place. It's about seeing how that place shapes every decision, every relationship, and every outcome. Performance. Performance is what happens when preparation meets presence. It's not just about putting on a show. It's about delivering under pressure in front of others when the outcome is still uncertain. Whether it's an actor on stage, an athlete on the field, or a speaker in front of a crowd, performance is the moment where everything comes together or falls apart in real time. At its simplest, performance is an action done for an audience. That audience might be one person or thousands, but their presence changes everything. It introduces stakes, it creates feedback, and it demands focus. What might feel easy in private suddenly takes on a new weight when others are watching. Performance is also deeply tied to timing and emotion. A line delivered too soon might miss its impact. A gesture held too long might feel forced. Good performers aren't just executing a routine, they're adjusting, responding, reading the room. They're shaping the moment as it unfolds. But performance isn't limited to the arts or sports. It shows up everywhere. In job interviews, first dates, courtroom arguments, even parenting. Any time we step into a role and act with intent in front of others, we're performing. We're balancing authenticity with expectation, vulnerability with control. What makes performance powerful is its fleeting nature. It's here, then gone. You can record it, but the energy of a live moment, the tension, the risk, the connection, can't truly be captured. That's what makes it memorable. Ultimately, performance is a test of presence. It reveals what we've practiced, how we handle stress, and how we communicate meaning under pressure. It's one of the purest expressions of what it means to be prepared and to be seen. Seeing the front. Most decisions are made far from the action, in offices, boardrooms, or quiet studies. But the best decisions often start somewhere else, at the front. Seeing the front means going directly to where the action is, where the work happens, where the reality lives. It's about getting a first-hand look instead of relying only on summaries, reports, or filtered updates. This idea has roots in military strategy. A general who visits the front lines gets a sense of the terrain, the morale, the true pace of battle, things that can't always be captured in a map or relayed through a chain of command. Maps simplify, reports distort, but direct experience brings clarity. The same principle applies outside the military. In business, leaders who walk the floor often learn more than they would from a spreadsheet. They notice broken processes, hear unfiltered feedback, and pick up on team dynamics that never make it into official channels. In medicine, surgeons who observe the full patient journey, from diagnosis to discharge, often discover practical improvements that never appear in lab results. Across industries, seeing the front exposes blind spots that theory alone can't fix. It's also a powerful tool against bias. Second-hand information often reflects the perspectives and incentives of the people delivering it. Managers want to look competent. Teams want to avoid blame. Everyone edits. Seeing the front helps cut through that, grounding judgment in direct observation. Of course, not everything can be personally witnessed. But when the stakes are high or the situation unclear, first-hand experience changes the equation. It's not about micromanaging. It's about eliminating guesswork. Seeing the front keeps leaders tethered to reality, which is where the best decisions begin. Asymmetric warfare. Most battles aren't fought on equal terms. When one side is outgunned, outnumbered, or outspent, they rarely fight head-on. Instead, they adapt. That's the idea behind asymmetric warfare. A conflict where the two sides have vastly different strengths, strategies, or goals. In traditional warfare, both armies might face off with similar tools, tanks, troops, and technology. But in asymmetric warfare, one side, usually the weaker one, avoids direct confrontation. They use speed, unpredictability, and unorthodox tactics to offset their disadvantages. Guerrilla warfare, sabotage, cyber attacks, and terrorism are common tools in this playbook. The logic is simple. Don't fight on your enemy's terms. Instead of trying to destroy a powerful army outright, create chaos, erode morale, and stretch resources thin. A single explosive device or sudden ambush can force a much larger force to slow down, change tactics, or pour energy into defense. It's not about winning a traditional victory. It's about making the fight too costly for the stronger side to continue. You'll often see asymmetric warfare in insurgencies, where a small group pushes back against a larger occupying force. But the idea shows up in other areas too. From political movements using social media to undermine state narratives, to hackers disrupting corporations without ever stepping into a building. It's any situation where the underdog changes the rules instead of playing by them. The core of asymmetric warfare is leverage. It's about making small actions have outsized effects. And while it often sparks controversy because of the tactics involved, it highlights a broader truth. Power isn't just about size or strength. Sometimes it's about strategy, timing, and understanding how to turn weaknesses into unexpected advantages. Two-front war. Fighting a war on one front is difficult. Fighting on two fronts at the same time can be disastrous. The term two-front war describes a situation where a force is forced to divide its attention, energy, and resources between two separate battles, often in different locations, against different enemies. In military history, few things have proven more costly. One of the clearest examples is Nazi Germany during World War II. By attacking the Soviet Union, while still battling the Allied forces in the West, Germany stretched itself too thin. Supplies had to be split, troops had to be rotated, and no single front had full support. Eventually, this division played a major role in their defeat. But the idea of a two-front war goes far beyond the battlefield. In business, politics, or even personal life, trying to fight multiple major battles at once can reduce the effectiveness of both efforts. A company that's restructuring internally while also facing aggressive competitors may find neither challenge is handled well. An individual trying to recover from illness while navigating a personal crisis may feel pulled in too many directions. The problem isn't just distraction, it's resource drain. There's only so much energy, attention, and support to go around. A two-front conflict often leads to slower progress, poor decisions, and higher risk of failure on both sides. That's why some of the most effective strategies involve avoiding a two-front scenario entirely. Nations form alliances to secure one side while they focus on another. Organizations resolve internal conflict before expanding. Even in everyday life, people often focus on stabilizing one part of their world before tackling another. Understanding the danger of divided effort is a fundamental part of strategy, whether in war or anywhere else. Counterinsurgency. In modern conflict, some of the hardest battles aren't fought between armies, but between governments and insurgents. Counterinsurgency is the strategy used to fight those battles. It's not just about defeating enemies with force. It's about controlling the environment where insurgency grows. Insurgents typically rely on guerrilla tactics, small mobile attacks, hiding among civilians, using the terrain and public sentiment to their advantage. They avoid direct confrontation because they usually lack the resources of a conventional army. That's what makes them hard to defeat with traditional military power. Counterinsurgency, often abbreviated as COIN, is the set of strategies used to combat these irregular threats. It's not just military, it's political, social, and economic. The goal isn't just to eliminate insurgents, but to win over the population they rely on for support. This might involve building infrastructure, improving public services, or working closely with local communities to build trust and reduce the appeal of rebellion. A well-known example is the US campaign in Iraq during the 2007 surge. where General David Petraeus shifted the focus from purely military action to more community-driven tactics. Soldiers patrolled neighborhoods, built relationships, supported reconstruction, and tried to separate insurgents from the people they depended on. The goal was to change the conditions that allowed insurgency to thrive. Counterinsurgency is often slow, difficult, and full of trade-offs. It demands careful coordination, cultural understanding, and constant adaptation. Heavy-handed tactics can backfire, pushing more people into the arms of insurgents. But without action, insurgencies can grow into full-blown civil wars. What makes counterinsurgency unique is that it operates as much in the minds of the people as it does on the battlefield. Success depends not just on defeating an enemy, but on reshaping the environment that gave rise to the conflict in the first place. Mutually assured destruction. If two sides each hold a gun to the other's head, neither wants to pull the trigger first. That's the logic behind mutually assured destruction, a military strategy that emerged during the Cold War, and one that continues to shape global conflict today. At its core, mutually assured destruction, or MAD, is the idea that if two powerful enemies both have the ability to wipe each other out completely, neither will actually use their weapons. Why? Because launching an attack guarantees their own destruction in return. In the nuclear age, this meant that countries like the United States and the Soviet Union stockpiled enough atomic weapons to ensure that even if one launched a surprise strike, the other would still have time to respond and devastate the attacker. This strategy is built on deterrence. The threat of retaliation is what keeps everyone in check. As strange as it sounds, peace is preserved not through trust, but through fear. Fear of a total, irreversible catastrophe. But the concept of MAD isn't limited to military standoffs. It also shows up in business. Two companies might avoid a price war not because they care about each other, but because both know it would lead to mutual losses. By holding back, both stay afloat. The balance is fragile, but effective, until one side breaks the rules. There's a hidden risk in all this. The system only works as long as everyone stays rational. One error, one miscommunication, and the deterrent becomes a disaster. The more powerful the weapons, or the higher the stakes, the more catastrophic a single mistake could be. Mutually assured destruction is one of the strangest strategies in human history. A peace maintained not by cooperation, but by the shared guarantee of ruin. Trust. Trust is what lets us move through life without constant fear or hesitation. When you eat at a restaurant, you trust that the food is safe. When you get on a bus, you trust the driver knows the route. Even using money requires trust that others will accept it in exchange for goods and services. In ways both big and small, trust is the invisible glue that holds everything together. At its core, trust is a willingness to rely on someone or something without having full proof. It's a kind of shortcut for decision-making. Without trust, we'd need to personally verify every claim, inspect every object, and test every person. That would be exhausting. So instead, we build systems, reputations, and routines that let us operate more smoothly. In close relationships, trust often forms over time through consistency and shared experience. In broader society, trust is often structured through laws, certifications, or institutions. For example, you don't know the pilot flying your plane, but you trust the training process that made them qualified. But trust is fragile. Once broken, it's hard to restore. One data breach can damage a company's reputation for years. One lie can strain a friendship permanently. That's why systems that depend on trust usually include checks, transparency, accountability, or third-party verification to keep that trust strong. Still, trust isn't just about safety, it's also what allows progress. Teams that trust each other innovate faster. Economies built on trust move more efficiently. When people trust their leaders, cooperation increases. Trust lowers the friction in human interaction. In a world too complex to verify everything ourselves, trust is what lets us function at scale. It allows strangers to coordinate, institutions to endure, and societies to thrive. Bias from incentives. People don't always believe what's true. They often believe what's useful, especially when it benefits them. That's the idea behind bias from incentives. When rewards or consequences are tied to a specific belief or outcome, people tend to lean in that direction, even if it means bending the truth or ignoring inconvenient facts. This isn't just manipulation. It's often unconscious. A doctor who's paid more to recommend a certain treatment might genuinely convince themselves it's the best option, even if it's not. A lawyer might come to believe their client is innocent, not just because it's their job to defend them, but because believing that makes their job easier. Incentives don't just influence behavior, they shape perception. This is why conflicts of interest are so dangerous. When someone stands to gain from a particular conclusion, their judgment becomes cloudy. They might still be intelligent, well-meaning, and hard-working, but their conclusions will be tilted, sometimes without them realizing it. The stronger the incentive, the harder it is to see clearly. And incentives aren't always financial. Social approval, career advancement, convenience, even personal identity can all act as incentives. A scientist may downplay flaws in their research because their reputation depends on it. A manager might avoid bad news because it threatens their image of control. This doesn't mean people are dishonest by nature. It means we're human and highly responsive to reward structures. That's why well-designed systems don't just rely on good intentions. They align incentives with accuracy and fairness. Understanding bias from incentives is crucial for navigating modern life. It reminds us to question not just what someone believes, but why they might believe it. Because when incentives are misaligned, even honest people can unknowingly mislead others and themselves. Pavlovian Association. You might not remember the meal, but you remember the song that played while you ate it. And now, every time you hear that song, you're suddenly hungry or nostalgic. That's Pavlovian Association at work. The idea comes from a simple experiment by Ivan Pavlov. He rang a bell before feeding dogs. After a while, the dogs began to salivate at the sound of the bell alone, even when no food followed. They had learned to associate the sound with the reward. It wasn't about logic or thought. It was reflex, automatic. Humans do this constantly. We link emotions to sights, sounds, smells, and even brands based on past experiences. The smell of sunscreen might trigger memories of summer vacations. The ding of a notification can cause a spike of anxiety, not because of what's in the message, but because of what similar messages brought in the past. This is more than a psychological quirk. It shapes behavior. Politicians wear certain colors or play certain music to trigger emotional responses. Advertisers pair products with attractive visuals or catchy jingles to build positive associations. And on a personal level, we often react to people or situations based on history, not current reality. The important thing is, the response doesn't require current reasoning. You don't have to think your way into a reaction. The pattern fires automatically. Over time, repeated pairings build strong mental links, sometimes helpful, sometimes not. A student might feel nervous just walking into a classroom, not because of that day's lesson, but because of the stress they've felt there before. Pavlovian Association helps us learn quickly, but it also means our environment can program us in subtle ways. Recognizing how these associations form is key to understanding how our minds respond, often without us realizing it. Tendency to feel envy and jealousy. Envy doesn't need an explanation. It's that subtle sting when someone else gets what you wanted, whether it's praise, money, beauty, or success. It's built in, and it affects more of our choices than we like to admit. The tendency to feel envy and jealousy is one of the most ancient and powerful social instincts humans have. It likely evolved as a survival mechanism. In early tribes, resources were limited, and fairness often meant survival. If one person got significantly more food, mates, or attention, others would naturally start to compare and feel resentment. These feelings weren't just emotional, they motivated action. Even today, envy plays out in small and large ways. A co-worker gets a raise and suddenly you're questioning your own worth. A neighbor buys a new car and yours suddenly feels inadequate. The objects haven't changed, but the context has, and that's the key. Envy thrives in comparison. It doesn't matter whether someone is objectively well off. What matters is that they're better off than you, especially if they're in your circle. We rarely envy celebrities. We envy classmates, colleagues, siblings. People close enough that their success feels like a measurement of our own. This reaction can drive progress. Envy can push people to work harder or innovate. But it also causes irrational decisions, sabotaging others, rejecting help, or feeling bitter instead of inspired. In groups or societies, unchecked envy can tear down institutions, undermine collaboration, and drive conflict. That's why any well-functioning system, whether it's a team, an organization, or a nation, needs to account for envy. Not ignore it, not pretend it doesn't exist, but recognize it, plan for it, and find ways to reduce its corrosive effects. Because envy isn't just a feeling, it's a force. And if left unmanaged, it can quietly unravel even the most well-intentioned designs. Tendency to distort due to liking, loving, or disliking, hating. It's easy to spot someone else's bias, much harder to see our own, especially when it's caused by something as basic as liking or disliking someone. Humans have a strong tendency to distort judgment based on emotional attachment. When we like a person, we're more likely to excuse their mistakes, praise their ideas, and interpret their actions in the best possible light. When we dislike someone, the opposite happens. We criticize more harshly, doubt their motives, and expect the worst. This distortion shows up everywhere. In workplaces, a manager might unconsciously favor an employee they get along with, even if others are more competent. In politics, supporters of a candidate may overlook serious flaws, while opponents see nothing but faults. Even in neutral decisions, the facts don't change, but our filters do. The problem is that this distortion isn't always dramatic or deliberate. It's often subtle. We remember positive details about things we like and forget the rest. We scrutinize the behavior of people we dislike, searching for patterns that confirm our feelings. Over time, this creates a feedback loop. Liking someone makes us interpret their behavior positively, which reinforces our liking. Disliking does the same in reverse. This kind of bias can lead to poor decisions, strained relationships, and inaccurate evaluations. It blinds us to nuance. A bad idea from a friend can seem brilliant, while a good suggestion from a rival might be dismissed out of hand. Recognizing this tendency is important because it highlights how much of our thinking is emotional, even when we believe it's rational. The challenge isn't just in correcting others' distortions. It's noticing when our own feelings are doing the editing, quietly rewriting reality before we even realize it. Denial. Denial isn't just ignoring reality. It's the active process of convincing ourselves that something isn't true, even when the evidence is right in front of us. At its core, denial is a defense mechanism. It helps people avoid pain, anxiety, or uncomfortable truths. When a problem feels too big, too overwhelming, or too personal, the brain often chooses the path of least resistance. Pretend it doesn't exist. This can be conscious or completely automatic. In everyday life, denial shows up in small and large ways. A person in financial trouble may keep spending as if nothing's wrong. Someone with a serious health issue might avoid going to the doctor. A group might downplay clear warning signs because admitting the truth would require major change. In each case, denial buys time, but at a cost. Denial becomes especially dangerous when it blocks necessary action. In substance abuse, for example, people often insist they're in control long after their behavior says otherwise. In relationships, people may stay in unhealthy situations by refusing to acknowledge just how bad things have become. And in institutions, denial can spread. Leaders and followers both ignoring problems that threaten the entire system. But denial isn't always about weakness or laziness. Sometimes it's a way to maintain stability. In high-stress environments like combat or crisis zones, denial can delay emotional collapse long enough to survive. It can also be a tactic, avoiding accountability by pretending a problem doesn't exist. Still, the longer denial continues, the harder the crash usually is. Because the truth doesn't go away, it just waits. And when it finally breaks through, it often demands more from us than if we had faced it sooner. Denial can feel like protection, but more often, it's just a delay of the inevitable. Availability heuristic. A plane crash makes headlines across the world. Millions read about it, watch the footage, and talk about it for days. Even though air travel remains one of the safest modes of transportation, people start feeling nervous about flying. That's the availability heuristic at work. The availability heuristic is a mental shortcut we use to make judgments quickly. Instead of weighing all the facts, we rely on the examples that come most easily to mind, usually the ones that are recent, vivid, or emotionally charged. If something feels easier to recall, we tend to believe it's more common or more likely to happen. This shortcut helps us move through the world without overloading our brains, but it also skews our sense of probability. For instance, people often overestimate the risk of rare events like shark attacks or kidnappings because they hear about them in the news. At the same time, they might underestimate more common dangers like heart disease or car accidents simply because those stories aren't as dramatic or memorable. Marketing takes full advantage of this bias. A flashy advertisement or a customer review that sticks in your head can outweigh 100 quiet facts. Politicians use it too, repeating memorable sound bites to influence public opinion. Even in personal decisions, like judging someone's character, a single standout moment can shape your entire perception. The availability heuristic isn't about being lazy or irrational. It's the brain's way of managing complexity. But it means our judgments are often shaped less by actual data and more by what's most easily brought to mind. And while that can be helpful in day-to-day life, it also opens the door to consistent errors in how we see risk, make choices, and understand the world around us. Failure to account for base rates. A man walks into a hospital showing vague symptoms, fatigue, dizziness, and a fast heartbeat. The doctor, alarmed by the severity, considers a rare heart condition. But here's the catch. It's statistically far more likely the man is dehydrated, stressed, or has a common flu. Ignoring that bigger picture is what's known as a failure to account for base rates. Base rates are the background statistics, the general odds of something being true before any new information is introduced. And failing to consider them is a common mental mistake. We often put too much weight on individual details, while ignoring how common or rare something actually is in the wider world. Imagine you hear that a student is quiet, loves books, and avoids parties. You might assume they study literature. But statistically, more students study business or healthcare. Even if someone fits a description, it doesn't mean they belong to the least likely category. That's how base rate neglect works. We get so focused on specifics, we forget to zoom out. This mistake shows up in medicine, investing, job hiring, even criminal justice. People might overestimate the likelihood of a rare disease or the chance of success for a flashy startup because they ignore broader trends. They go with the story that sounds right, not the one that usually is. Base rate neglect happens because human minds aren't built for statistics. We prefer stories, patterns, and intuition. But when we skip the base rates, we risk making decisions that feel accurate, but actually aren't. Understanding this bias doesn't mean ignoring unique information. It means balancing it with the bigger picture. In a world flooded with detail, sometimes the most important truth is the simplest one. What usually happens probably will again. Tendency to stereotype. You meet someone for the first time, and within seconds, your brain starts making assumptions about where they're from, what they believe, how they'll act. You haven't seen any real evidence yet, but your brain has already filled in the blanks. That's the tendency to stereotype. Stereotyping is the mental shortcut we use to quickly understand people and situations by fitting them into pre-existing categories. It's not always malicious, and it's not always wrong. In fact, it's one of the brain's default strategies to conserve effort. The human mind can't afford to carefully analyze every person it encounters, so it generalizes. At its core, stereotyping is pattern recognition. If you've seen 10 red apples, you expect the 11th to be similar. In the same way, if a person fits certain visual or behavioral cues, your brain connects them to past experiences or cultural narratives, even if those connections are weak or outdated. This shortcut works reasonably well in many everyday tasks, but when applied to human beings, it often overlooks nuance and individuality. People get reduced to labels. Context gets ignored. And that's where the trouble begins. A stereotype might help you guess someone's profession based on their clothing, but it won't tell you about their personality, abilities, or values. The danger isn't just in being wrong, it's in not checking whether you're wrong. Stereotyping can influence hiring decisions, courtroom judgments, and even casual interactions without us realizing it. It saves time, but at the cost of accuracy and fairness. While this mental shortcut is deeply rooted in how we process the world, being aware of it helps us slow down when it matters. Not every quick judgment needs correcting, but the ones that shape how we treat people usually do. Failure to see false conjunctions. You hear a description of a woman named Linda. She's outspoken, bright, deeply concerned with social justice, and participated in anti-nuclear protests. Now you're asked, is it more likely that Linda is a bank teller, or that she's a bank teller and active in the feminist movement? Many people choose the second option. It feels right. It matches the story. But statistically, it's incorrect. This is the failure to see false conjunctions. When we mistakenly believe that a specific combination of characteristics is more likely than a broader, simpler one. It's a common error in reasoning, first revealed by psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman through what's now called the Linda problem. Here's why it's a mistake. In probability, the chance of two things being true at once, like Linda being a bank teller and a feminist, can never be greater than the chance of just one of them being true. A subset can't be more likely than the larger set it belongs to. But when details feel meaningful or vivid, our brain overlooks the math. This bias shows up in everyday thinking. We might believe a candidate is more likely to succeed because they're both charismatic and hardworking, even though just being hardworking alone already covers the larger probability space. Or we assume someone is guilty not just of a crime, but of being part of a larger conspiracy, simply because it fits a compelling narrative. We fall into these traps because our minds prefer stories over statistics. A detailed, coherent explanation feels more convincing than a vague but statistically stronger one. Understanding false conjunctions reminds us to separate emotional plausibility from logical probability. In a world flooded with information, resisting the lure of vivid stories and focusing on actual likelihoods can help us think more clearly. Social proof. If everyone around you is staring at the sky, odds are you'll look up too, even if you have no idea why. This is social proof. It's the tendency to use other people's behavior as a guide for what to think, feel, or do in uncertain situations. Instead of carefully analyzing a situation from scratch, we often look to the crowd and follow its lead. Most of the time, this shortcut works, but sometimes it doesn't. At its core, social proof is about trust and survival. As a social species, humans evolved in groups. Sticking with the tribe increased your chances of protection, food, and shared knowledge. So our brains developed a simple rule. If others are doing it, it's probably the right move. You see this in everyday life. Restaurant looks empty. You assume it's not good. See a long line outside. Suddenly, it feels worth waiting for. This same principle is used in advertising when products are labeled most popular, or when reviews are front and center. If enough people approve, we feel safer joining in. But this instinct can backfire. Groupthink, viral misinformation, and even dangerous behavior can spread rapidly when people follow others without stopping to evaluate for themselves. History is full of moments where crowds moved in the wrong direction, not because of logic, but because of each other. Social proof isn't about mindless copying. It's about efficient decision-making in a complex world. Most of the time, it saves time and energy. But understanding how it works helps us pause in the moments that matter. Just because a crowd is moving doesn't always mean it's headed somewhere smart. Narrative instinct. We don't just notice events, we turn them into stories. This is the narrative instinct. It's the human tendency to organize facts, memories, and experiences into structured sequences with causes, effects, and meaning. It's not just how we entertain ourselves, it's how we make sense of the world. From an early age, our brains are wired to find patterns, and the story format, beginning, middle, end, helps us remember information, predict outcomes, and share understanding with others. A random list of facts feels empty, but give it a setting, a motive, and a conflict, and suddenly we're hooked. This instinct is incredibly powerful. We use it every day, often without realizing it. If your friend cancels plans, you might fill in the blanks with a story. They must be upset, or maybe they're avoiding me. Even when we don't have full information, our minds build narratives to connect the dots. This has helped humans build culture, religion, history, even national identity. All are shaped by stories passed down through generations. A company's brand isn't just a product. It's a story about values, innovation, or rebellion. Movements gain traction when they frame events into narratives with clear heroes and villains. But this same instinct can distort reality. We often prefer stories that are neat and emotionally satisfying, even if they're inaccurate. We might ignore random chance, oversimplify motives, or invent cause and effect relationships that don't exist, just to make a story feel complete. The narrative instinct isn't good or bad on its own. It's a tool, one that helps us understand the world and communicate with others. But like any tool, it works best when we're aware we're using it. Because once we recognize how much of life is shaped by stories, we can start to look beyond them when we need to. Curiosity instinct. We don't just want answers, we're wired to chase them. This is the curiosity instinct. It's the built-in drive to seek out information, explore the unknown, and fill in gaps in our understanding. Unlike hunger or fear, curiosity isn't about immediate survival, but it's just as deeply embedded in our behavior. At its simplest, curiosity shows up when we notice something that doesn't quite fit. A door slightly ajar, a sound we can't identify, a question with no clear answer. That tension between what we know and what we don't creates a kind of itch in the mind, and we're compelled to scratch it. This instinct has shaped human progress. Children ask endless questions not to be difficult, but because their brains are actively wiring themselves through exploration. Science, philosophy, and invention all begin the same way, with someone wondering why or what if. We build knowledge not by being told things, but by being curious enough to go looking. But curiosity isn't random. We're more drawn to puzzles we think we can solve, ones that offer just enough mystery to challenge us without overwhelming us. This is why cliffhangers keep us watching, and why a trivia question with a blank space is hard to ignore. Even marketing and design rely on this instinct. A headline that poses a question or an image that seems just a little off will grab our attention, because curiosity pulls us forward before logic even has time to weigh in. The curiosity instinct is one of our most powerful tools for learning, creativity, and adaptation. It pushes us beyond routine, encourages discovery, and allows us to transform not just what we know, but how we think. Language instinct. From a young age, children start picking up words without being formally taught. They don't just mimic sounds, they build full sentences, follow grammar rules, and understand meaning. This is the foundation of what's known as the language instinct. The idea is that humans are biologically wired to acquire language, not just to speak random words, but to develop and use complex, rule-based systems of communication. Unlike reading or writing, which need to be taught explicitly, spoken language seems to unfold naturally, as long as a child is exposed to it early in life. Even in completely different environments and cultures, children develop grammar and syntax without formal instruction. This concept, introduced by Noam Chomsky and expanded by Steven Pinker, suggests that language isn't simply passed down like a tradition. It's hard-coded into the human brain. What varies is the vocabulary and surface rules. What stays the same is our capacity to structure those words into endless combinations of ideas. There's also evidence from cases of isolated deaf children who, when not exposed to any standard sign language, create their own signed systems that still follow grammatical rules. The structure seems to emerge from within, not from external teaching. This shows that language isn't just a tool we use. It's a framework we're born ready to build. The language instinct is what makes us able to describe things we've never seen, argue ideas that don't exist yet, or joke about concepts with layers of meaning. It enables cooperation, storytelling, debate, and even deception. In many ways, it's the foundation of human culture and cognition, not just how we express our thoughts, but how we form them in the first place. First conclusion bias. We tend to trust our first impression. Once we form an initial conclusion, it sticks, often much more than we realize. This is called first conclusion bias, and it's one of the most common mental shortcuts the brain takes. When we're faced with a problem or new information, our mind looks for the quickest, simplest explanation. Once it lands on one that feels right, it stops looking. That early conclusion becomes the mental anchor, and everything that follows gets filtered through it. This bias is efficient. It saves time and effort, but it can also lock us into incorrect assumptions. Imagine you misplace your phone and immediately assume someone stole it. From that point on, your mind starts collecting evidence that fits the theft theory, ignoring more likely explanations, like you leaving it in the car. In more serious settings, this bias can lead to major errors. A manager might label an employee as lazy based on one missed deadline and overlook months of consistent work. A doctor might misdiagnose a patient early on and resist revising the diagnosis even when new symptoms appear. This tendency is strong because it feels rewarding. The brain gets a hit of certainty from figuring it out, and that feeling discourages further thinking. It's a kind of cognitive inertia, the mental version of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Overcoming first conclusion bias doesn't require complex tools, just the habit of asking, what else could explain this? A quick pause to revisit assumptions or seek disconfirming evidence can open up much better outcomes. In many situations, the first explanation isn't always wrong, but it often isn't complete. And learning to second-guess that first impulse can be one of the most valuable mental habits we build. Tendency to overgeneralize from small samples. One bad meal at a new restaurant, and it's never eating there again. That's how quickly our brains can jump from a single experience to a sweeping conclusion. This is the tendency to overgeneralize from small samples, a mental shortcut where we treat a handful of cases as representative of a much larger whole. It happens because generalizing is usually helpful. We don't need to see 1,000 bees sting to know they're dangerous. But sometimes our brain applies this shortcut too broadly or too quickly. The root problem lies in ignoring what statisticians call the law of large numbers. This law tells us that reliable conclusions usually need large amounts of data, but our minds prefer speed over statistical accuracy. A manager interviews 3 applicants, and one says something clever. Suddenly, they're assumed to be the best. A new product launches and flops in its first week, and the whole idea gets scrapped. Small samples are noisy. They can be shaped by random luck, timing, or incomplete context. Drawing conclusions from them is like trying to judge a movie after watching just the trailer. This tendency also drives stereotypes. Meet 2 people from the same group, and if they happen to behave a certain way, that trait gets wrongly assigned to everyone in that group. That's how mental shortcuts can turn into harmful assumptions. The brain isn't built for calculating statistical probabilities in everyday life, but being aware of this bias helps. When stakes are high, or when patterns seem too simple too quickly, slowing down and questioning the sample size can lead to far better decisions. We can't eliminate this tendency altogether, but we can train ourselves to notice when a small slice of reality might not reflect the full picture. Relative satisfaction, misery tendencies. Someone earning $50,000 a year might feel content until they find out their coworker earns 60. Suddenly, what once felt like enough doesn't feel that way anymore. This is a classic case of relative satisfaction and misery. It's the idea that our sense of happiness doesn't come from absolute outcomes, but from how those outcomes compare to something else, our past, our peers, or our expectations. Most people don't measure success or comfort by a fixed number. They measure it by reference points. If your previous job paid less, a raise feels great. But if everyone around you is earning more, that same raise might feel disappointing. In other words, satisfaction is deeply comparative. This principle also explains why people can feel unhappy even when they're objectively doing well. A person living in a spacious apartment may feel cramped after scrolling through luxury home tours online. A student with a B+ might feel like a failure if all their friends got A's. Envy is one of the most recognizable side effects, but it's only part of the picture. The same comparison mechanism also affects motivation, goal setting, and overall life satisfaction. It's why someone who loses £10 might feel discouraged if a friend loses 15, or why someone who finishes second in a race can feel worse than the person who finishes third. This tendency distorts how we perceive success, value, and even progress. It's also a big reason people struggle to predict what will make them happy in the long run, because we underestimate just how much our feelings depend on comparison points, many of which shift constantly. Understanding this pattern doesn't just explain human behavior, it helps us spot when our emotions are reacting to the gap, not the ground. Commitment and consistency bias. You've probably seen it happen. Someone defends a decision long after it stops making sense, just because they made it. That's commitment and consistency bias at work. This is a well-documented tendency where people feel pressure, often internally, to act in ways that align with what they've previously said, done, or believed. Once we've made a choice, even a small one, we tend to stick with it. And the more public or effortful that choice was, the harder it becomes to walk it back. The bias itself isn't irrational in every case. In social groups, consistent people are seen as trustworthy and reliable. If someone sees they'll do something and follows through, they're easier to cooperate with. But that instinct toward consistency can override better judgment. A classic example comes from marketing. When someone agrees to a small request, like signing a petition, they're more likely to agree to a larger follow-up, such as donating money. The initial commitment builds a self-image. I support this cause. That self-image then demands consistency. We also see this bias in daily life. Someone might continue investing time, money, or energy into a project that clearly isn't working just because they've already committed. Admitting it's a mistake can feel like admitting failure, not just in the action, but in identity. And so, people double down, even when it's not in their best interest. This behavior gets even stickier when paired with first conclusion bias, the tendency to stop evaluating once we've decided. Together, they form a cognitive trap. You reach a conclusion early and then stick with it too long. Understanding commitment and consistency bias isn't just useful in recognizing others' stubborn behavior. It's a powerful tool for recognizing when our own thinking is on autopilot, stuck not because it's right, but because it's familiar. Hindsight bias. It's easy to look back at a decision and think, I knew that would happen. But most of the time, we didn't. That feeling is called hindsight bias. It's the tendency to believe, after something has happened, that the outcome was more predictable than it actually was. Our minds reshape the past to make it feel more logical, more obvious, like we saw it coming all along. This isn't just a memory glitch, it's part of how we try to make sense of the world. Once we know the answer, we tend to build a story that leads to it. And because the brain prefers neat stories over messy uncertainty, it quietly edits out all the doubt and ambiguity we originally felt. Take sports, for example. After a team wins, fans often say, "I knew they were going to pull through." But rewind just a few hours, and many of those same people were nervous or unsure. Hindsight bias erases that tension and replaces it with confidence that wasn't there at the time. The same thing happens in business, politics, or personal life. A product fails, a relationship ends, a plan doesn't work out, and suddenly everyone remembers the signs that were obvious. In reality, those signs were mixed in with dozens of others that could have pointed in different directions. This bias can lead to overconfidence in future predictions. It also makes it harder to learn from mistakes, because if we think we always knew it, we might ignore the factors we missed. That's why hindsight bias matters. It doesn't just distort how we remember the past, it shapes how we prepare for the future. Recognizing it helps us stay honest about uncertainty and gives us a clearer picture of how decisions actually unfold. Sensitivity to fairness. People care deeply about fairness, even when it comes at a cost. That's not just a social preference, it's a hardwired instinct. Studies show that even small children, and some animals like monkeys, have a basic sense of what's fair and what isn't. And when that fairness is violated, people often react strongly, even if they don't directly benefit from setting things right. This instinct plays out in everyday life. A co-worker gets credit for your work. Someone cuts in line. A friend takes more than they give. Even small imbalances can trigger big emotions. That's because fairness is tied closely to our sense of justice, equality, and trust. When things feel fair, we're more willing to cooperate. When they don't, we shut down, retaliate, or withdraw. But here's where it gets complicated. Fairness is not a fixed rule. What feels fair in one situation or culture might feel unfair in another. In some societies, dividing everything equally is considered just. In others, fairness is based on need, effort, or seniority. Our sensitivity to fairness is real, but what we call fair often depends on the context we're in. That's why disputes over fairness can escalate so easily. Each side may genuinely believe the rules are being broken, even if both are following different ideas of justice. And in large systems, like governments, workplaces, or economies, this can lead to serious conflict if people feel they're being treated unequally or dishonestly. Still, the instinct itself has evolutionary value. Groups that upheld fairness tended to survive better over time. It helped maintain cooperation, reduce resentment, and enforce mutual respect. Understanding our sensitivity to fairness helps explain not just how people behave, but why we're so willing to fight for what we believe is right, even when there's no reward in it. Tendency to overestimate consistency of behavior. Someone cuts you off in traffic. It's easy to label them as a reckless or rude person. But what if they were rushing to the hospital? The truth is, we often make quick judgments about people's character based on isolated actions, and then expect those behaviors to repeat. This is called the tendency to overestimate the consistency of behavior. Psychologists also refer to it as the fundamental attribution error. It's the idea that we're more likely to explain someone's behavior by who they are, rather than by the situation they're in. When someone is late to a meeting, we might assume they're disorganized. If they're quiet at a party, we assume they're shy. We overlook the fact that they might have been stuck in traffic, or that they're just tired. And once we've made that assumption, we tend to expect the same behavior from them over and over. even if the original situation never repeats. This tendency is surprisingly persistent. In one famous study, people watched a student perform a series of tasks and quickly formed opinions about how hard-working or friendly the person was. Even when the situation changed, their expectations didn't. People were shocked when the same student acted differently later. The inconsistency felt like a betrayal, even though the student was just responding to a new environment. We do this with co-workers, friends, celebrities, and even strangers online. We think we know who someone is after seeing what they did once. But human behavior is messy. It shifts with stress, mood, incentives, and surroundings. Recognizing this tendency helps us approach others with more flexibility and fairness. People aren't robots running on a fixed personality script. They're adapting in real time, just like we are. Influence of stress. Stress doesn't just change how we feel, it changes how we think. In moments of pressure, your body floods with hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. Your heart races, your muscles tense, and quietly behind the scenes, your brain shifts gears. This shift is a survival feature. Under threat, the brain moves away from slow, logical thinking and leans into fast, instinctive responses. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as moving from System 2 thinking, deliberate and analytical, to System 1, quick and automatic. That's useful when you're running from danger. But in modern life, where problems are often social, emotional, or strategic, this switch can backfire. Stress doesn't just make us anxious, it amplifies almost every cognitive bias. Under pressure, people are more likely to stereotype, more likely to assume the worst, and far more likely to stick with their first conclusion. They rely on habits, even when the habit isn't useful in the moment. Decision quality drops not because we don't care, but because our mental bandwidth narrows. Think about someone trying to give a public speech while under extreme pressure. Their voice shakes, their memory falters, they misread the room. Not because they don't know what they're doing, but because stress hijacks the system that would normally help them adapt in real time. Elite performers, like emergency responders or soldiers, train for this. They repeat routines over and over so that even under stress, instinct leads them somewhere useful. But most people aren't trained like that, and stress often brings out the worst patterns of thought. The influence of stress is a quiet multiplier. It doesn't create new problems, it magnifies what's already there. That's why understanding how it shapes behavior is essential in everything from leadership to relationships to self-control. Survivorship bias. Most success stories are missing a critical detail, the failures we never hear about. This is the core of survivorship bias. It happens when we focus only on the people or things that survived a process and ignore everything that didn't. That can lead to distorted thinking, especially when trying to learn from outcomes. Take the classic example from World War II. Analysts studied bullet holes in planes returning from missions, trying to figure out where to reinforce them. At first, it seemed logical to strengthen the areas with the most damage. But statistician Abraham Wald pointed out something crucial. They were only looking at the planes that made it back. The real weakness was likely in the spots that showed no damage at all, because when those parts got hit, the plane didn't return. Survivorship bias also appears in business. You might hear how a billionaire dropped out of college and became wildly successful, so you assume dropping out is a good bet. But for every college dropout who made it big, there are countless others who didn't, and we don't hear about them. The data set is incomplete, skewed toward survivors. It shows up in fitness, in investing, even in advice books. We study the winners, assuming their strategies are what caused success. But often, those same strategies were used by others who failed. We just never hear about them. That silence creates the illusion that success is simple, reproducible, and within reach if we follow the same steps. Survivorship bias makes it easy to draw the wrong lessons. To really understand why something works or doesn't, you need to include the missing data, the failures, the flukes, and the stories that were never told. Without that, we're only learning from the lucky. Tendency to want to do something. When things go wrong, our first impulse is usually to act, do something, anything. This urge isn't always driven by logic. It's baked into our psychology. Psychologists call it the action bias, but you could just as easily call it the tendency to want to do something. It's what kicks in when we feel helpless or uncertain. And it's why people often push buttons, pull levers, or make decisions simply to feel like they're taking control. In sports, this shows up clearly. Studies of soccer goalkeepers during penalty kicks found that they tend to dive left or right almost every time. But statistically, the best strategy is often to stay in the center. Still, most goalkeepers move anyway. Why? Because standing still feels wrong. Even if the best action is no action, inaction feels like failure. This tendency isn't limited to sports. In meetings, someone brings up a problem, and people rush to suggest solutions, even if no one in the room fully understands the issue. In politics, leaders are often pressured to respond quickly, even before the facts are clear, just to appear decisive. And in personal life, when someone we care about is struggling, we often try to fix things, even when all they really needed was someone to listen. The desire to act is tied to control. It gives us a sense of agency, a feeling that we're not just sitting by while the world moves around us. But the truth is, not every problem needs a quick fix, and not every situation benefits from more input, more effort, or more motion. The tendency to want to do something is deeply human, but understanding it can help us recognize when patience, observation, or even deliberate inaction might be the smarter move. Falsification/confirmation bias. We all like being right. It feels good, it's reassuring, and it quietly shapes how we process the world around us, even when it shouldn't. This is where confirmation bias comes in. It's our natural tendency to seek out information that supports what we already believe, and to ignore or downplay anything that challenges it. If you think a certain diet works, you're more likely to notice stories and studies that back it up, and more likely to dismiss ones that don't. It's not intentional dishonesty. It's just how our brains prefer to operate, conserving energy by sticking to familiar ground. But this instinct is precisely what science was designed to work against. Instead of asking, how can I prove I'm right? Science asks, how could I be wrong? The method is built on falsification. The idea that a theory should be testable in a way that could potentially disprove it. If you can't imagine a situation in which a claim would fail, it's not a scientific claim. It's an article of faith. Astrology is a classic example. Its predictions are often vague or flexible enough to accommodate any outcome. So nothing can really prove it false, and that makes it unfalsifiable. In contrast, a scientific hypothesis must risk being wrong. That's what gives it strength when it survives. Confirmation bias isn't just a glitch in thinking. It's a powerful force behind bad decisions, stubborn ideologies, and junk science. Recognizing it doesn't mean we stop believing things, but it encourages us to ask better questions, seek disconfirming evidence, and build beliefs that can actually hold up under pressure. That's not just a scientific habit. It's a useful mindset for navigating a noisy world.